This is Kim Jang-cheol, an ordinary student from Korea. Or at least he used to be. Yesterday he unexpectedly became the Demon King Kratos, the final boss of a game he enjoyed playing. The objective of the game, Paladin of Blood, was to revive the ancient hero who was dormant. The problem is that he knew he had reincarnated as a demon king from a land that was at a great disadvantage. The doors open and a demon with glasses enters, calling for Lord Kratos. He is Aid Zephyros level 15. He brought news that preparations for war had been completed. The scene shows the demon army with axes in hand and flying dragons. The blood-drinking prince, Azurat, was excited to end their hunger with the new invasion they would undertake today. The cold monarch, Sergei, lamented the tragedy of being born in a barren land and the pain of having to feed on their own kind. The war that was about to begin would make history and bring many benefits to everyone there. The Archduke of Mist issued cold and powerful orders to the army to tear humans to pieces and crush elves. The tyrant of Black Rock, Baal, declared that all enemies should be turned into food. The army stood before the Demon King and Zephyros, all clamoring for a massacre in a war that had not yet begun. Kratos fiercely shouts for the demon army to hear him. The four captains stare at him seriously, waiting for what the Demon King had to say. He finally announces that this war could not happen under any circumstances. From that moment on, they would stop their attack and start cultivating. The thirsty generals are shocked by the absurdity they are hearing and begin to complain to the Demon King. Kratos lets out a roar of terror, terrified of how frightening his own generals were, but his expression was so imposing and dreadful that it made them all tremble. In a distant place from where the demons were, a new notification was announced that the 20th game had begun. Aged Kimchi, a playable character of level 9990 and a dormant enemy, awakens. The King of Demons knew he was at a great disadvantage and that if they started the war, he would definitely be killed by his hands. In a flashback, Kim Jang-cheol is shown. He had become a postgraduate student in an agriculture course at Korea University, hoping to become a rich farmer. He was very intelligent, so he became the best in the course in a short time. But being the best postgraduate student meant he would become slave number one. The professors took advantage of his intelligence to make him write their theses, help with their projects, and even work in the fields plowing the land. He was exhausted, wondering what he was doing with his life and why he was doing all the work while the professors took all the credit. His dopamine was depleted, he was going crazy. And the only way to get his dopamine fix was by playing. An extremely difficult game and very complicated to level up. No player had completed this game for the 19th time. He wanted so badly to feel a sense of accomplishment that he played without sleeping for a moment. He started leveling up, level 1, level 2, level 10, and thus he became the first person to complete Paladin of Blood, defeating the Demon King for the 19th time. Jang-cheol was exhausted from lack of sleep, but he was happy because he was the strongest in the world. The 20th playthrough would have an infernally insane difficulty. Even so, he remained confident that he would be able to level up. After all, he was the strongest. On the heroes panel he played, it showed the equipment he had put on his character. A pink costume with bows and a tight skirt, very reminiscent of a magical girl's outfit, like Sailor Moon herself. The maximum level was 9,999, so he would stop leveling up. At that point he no longer knew how long he had been playing. It seemed like years had passed. A message appeared on the screen, asking if he wanted to start his 20th playthrough. Without hesitation, his finger pressed the button to begin. He held the controller firmly, ready for another round of the game, but something seemed wrong. The television screen began to emit blue light beams growing around him. Suddenly, an invisible pull took over his being. His soul violently exited his mouth in a painful and terrifying way while his physical body remained behind, motionless and unresponsive. A scream of panic escaped his throat, but it was no use. He was being sucked through the TV screen. His soul came like a falling star from the sky, blue and bright. Jang-cheol, suspended between that strange threshold, felt a deep confusion take over him as he fell. What was happening was completely beyond his comprehension, leaving him stunned and without answers. But he needed to stay calm to reach a conclusion. He was blue now, so that meant it was his soul. This meant that he probably wouldn't die if he hit the ground at that height. He could see the life tower, which meant he had entered the game Paladin of Blood. Happiness grew within him when he realized that his life of being invincible and strong was just beginning. An uncontrolled laugh escaped him with this realization. His expression instantly changed as his floating soul approached the unconscious character's body, remembering that he had dressed him in a magical warrior costume. He observed the muscular doll holding a heart-shaped wand resting on his chest. It was, without a doubt, the most ridiculous thing he had ever seen. Looking closely, he didn't even want to transform into that anymore. At the same instant, with the same force as before, his soul was sucked in and sent to possess the Demon King Kratos, the final boss of the game he had already defeated countless times. The flashback ends and shows Kratos on his throne, consumed by frustration. If he hadn't had that idiotic thought after looking at aged Kimchi, he would have become the most powerful character of all. But no, he had to be stupid. A complete idiot. Zephyros was walking down a corridor when he heard someone in a room say that Kratos was getting weak. This would be the reason he seemed so scared and ordered the attacks to stop. Inside the room where the voices were heard were the four generals. Azurat proposed that they join forces and cut off Kratos' head, just as he had taken the reign from the old demon lord. In the end, they would divide the power of the throne among themselves. The Archduke of Mist then reminded them that, if they were mistaken and Kratos was not getting weaker, two of the four would certainly suffer fatal injuries or even die. Sergei hinted that they could try, as long as Azurat offered to be the group's shield. Ball says he is hungry. Azurat raised the possibility that he indeed had evidence of the demon lord's weakening. Sergei confirmed what should be done in that case, which would be to kill him. None of them showed hesitation. They were thirsty for it, with demonic smiles on their faces. Meanwhile, Zephyros heard everything through the gates of the room. Later, Zephyros appeared before Kratos with a worrying report. The army's morale had plummeted drastically. Cases of soldiers attacking and devouring each other became more frequent, and some even abandoned the demon land without warning. The four great demonic generals were furious. They said that Kratos had weakened and that they planned to join forces to cut off his head. Kratos remained seated on his throne, but concern had already settled in his gaze. Kratos realized that if the four attacked together, he would certainly die. He knew that if he appeared weak, he would have no chance. He thought of aged Kimchi. Without possessing him, he was just a corpse. Given this, he concluded that advancing directly into the human world would be the best option. Zephyros then revealed a red sphere, saying it was a record from the Paladin's tomb, sent by General Ogmia. In the video, aged Kimchi appeared delivering several merciless blows against a demon who desperately begged him to stop. He approached in silence, causing the creature, consumed by fear, to wonder what he would do next. Without hesitation, aged Kimchi plunged his thumbs into the demon's eyes, who let out a sharp scream of pain. Kratos broke out in a cold sweat as he thought about it. That scene seemed more like an insane staging than a fight, and he absolutely did not want to cross paths with aged Kimchi. He needed to stay where he was, no matter the cost. If he continued at that pace, he would end up looking weak or opting for surrender, and the four great demonic generals would kill him. But if he tried to flee to the human world, aged Kimchi would tear out his eyes and kill him anyway. He wondered desperately why he had ended up inside that game. Nothing made sense, and not even happiness seemed attainable in that place. It was then that a possibility arose in his mind. A strategy that could at least buy him time. If he could solve the food issue and calm the demons, perhaps he would have a chance to survive. Zephyros saw Kratos walking away and, confused, asked where he was going. Kratos apologized and replied that he would observe some lands for cultivation. Zephyros, surprised by the polite tone, could not hide his strangeness. He thought that, coming from someone as narcissistic, arrogant, and ill-mannered as Kratos, that sounded grotesque and disturbing. It was something he preferred not to hear again. Kratos observed Zephyros with strangeness. What was wrong with him? Was he trying to provoke him? Did he always act this strange way? In his memory, Zephyros was a character who appeared only once shortly before the final battle against the Demon King and without any clear explanation. A flashback shows when he played as aged Kimchi that he faced Zephyros. In the scene, Zephyros addressed the Paladin formally, saying that the Demon Lord did not wish to fight and asking him to retreat. As soon as he finished speaking, aged Kimchi attacked him without hesitation. Defeated and on his knees, Zephyros murmured regretfully for not having been strong enough to protect his master. Thinking now, Kratos recognized that this had made Zephyros a very popular character among players. Many thought he was deeply loyal to the Demon Lord and genuinely respected him. Zephyros again addressed Kratos, pointing out the recent error as unprecedented. He had never seen a Demon Lord lose so much trust from his own people. Kratos stared at him in silence, containing his irritation. As much as Zephyros was right, he was unbearable. Zephyros pulled out a notepad, writing something with a provocative calm. He commented ironically on Kratos' intention to cultivate in the demon lands, implying that his memory was as weak as a pigeon's. Kratos reacted, indignant at the audacity, reminding him of his position as Demon Lord and demanding respect. But Zephyros simply ignored the threat and continued as if nothing had happened. Kratos, now consumed by frustration, wondered why he showed no fear at all. Now the two were outside the palace, walking through the dry and barren land. Zephyros recalled that both the old Demon Lord and Kratos himself had already tried to cultivate that soil. With extreme temperatures and severe conditions, he made it clear that nothing there had a chance to grow and that Kratos more than anyone knew this very well. They continued walking through the dry land when Kratos commented that he knew that place was called the Land of Death. Still, he believed that, with his current abilities, it would be possible to save it. Inside, however, he could barely stand the idea of having to cultivate. He hated it all, but he needed to survive before anything else. Without thinking twice, he knelt and began to dig the earth with his bare hands, while Zephyros watched him in silence, confused by the scene. In a strange impulse, Kratos took a handful of earth and put it in his mouth, only to choke on the extreme dryness. Zephyros pulled out his notepad and, with complete calm, wrote that the Demon Lord had become a beggar who ate dirt. Annoyed, Kratos demanded to know what he was writing, but Zephyros replied that he was just doing his duty. After all, recording the Demon Lord's chronicles was important. He added that Kratos' memory capacity had certainly worsened. Kratos inside was seething with rage. That guy was really unbearable. Even so, one thing was certain. The soil there had absolutely no nutrients. Kratos' thought continued, now guided by technical and desperate reasoning. Nitrogen. An absolutely essential element for plant growth. Even though it makes up 78% of the atmosphere, plants could not use it directly. The atoms formed such strong triple bonds that chemical reactions became almost impossible. Humanity, then, had developed nitrogen fixation through chemical engineering, which led to a huge leap in food production. But to do that there? Impossible. There was nothing that could serve as a basis for cultivation. The only alternative would be to use the nitrogen fixation mechanism present in nature itself, lightning. With its high voltage, lightning oxidized nitrogen into nitrite, which mixed with rainwater and was absorbed by the soil. And then, as if something lit up inside his mind, Kratos remembered that this was exactly the essence of his main technique. He recalled the battle when he played as aged Kimchi and faced Kratos himself. In that fight, he saw Kratos scratch the back of his hands with his claws, releasing blood and a violent electrical discharge. The name of the attack was Bloody Strike. That day he had been defeated by that devastating attack. An attack that released lightning and moisture at the same time. A perfect technique to create fertile soil. Without further hesitation, Kratos warned Zephyros to step away. The other did not understand, only observed him. He began to scratch his own hand with sharp claws and blood flowed. The pain was immediate and strong. It was hard to believe that someone resorted to that technique so often. It seemed crazy. At that moment, Kratos noticed shadows behind a dry tree. The four generals were there, lurking, their eyes fixed on him. In his thoughts, there was only one certainty repeated like a mantra that he had weakened. Scared, Kratos let out a scream. Zephyros, beside him, merely coldly confirmed what everyone already knew. Kratos began to put the pieces together. This could only be a plan and that Zephyros was an assassin trying to provoke him and then kill him. But even so, he thought that was better than just waiting for death. He advanced, scratching his own hand with even more force. Blood flowed profusely. Pain took over his arm. But nothing happened. The blood fell on the dry ground and remained there without causing any reaction. He tried to stop the bleeding, pressing the wound. That's when he heard a voice behind him, calling him. It was one of the generals, asking if he was feeling ill, while the others smiled and wielded their weapons. Kratos looked at them, consumed by fear. He knew he was cornered. The scene then changed. Aged Kimchi observed the horizon. Before him, the line separating the human land from the forgotten land of demons. There was something familiar there. He vaguely felt memories of a past life. It was as if he had already lived that more than 10 times. Always following the same path, driven by an invisible force. The call of duty. But now that had disappeared. He looked at his own hand, waiting for an answer. The call of duty was silent. What was left to live for now? On the screen, information appeared above his silhouette. Aged Kimchi NPC level 9990. Then, without any reason to move forward, Kimchi turned back and went his own path. Kratos stood face to face with the demon generals with frightening smiles. Azurat questioned Kratos about the demon rule, saying that the strongest is the demon lord. Kratos broke out in a cold sweat as he thought that all of them were frightening and incredibly strong. He was even unable to use an ability and wondered if he would die. Azurat found it strange that the demon lord was trembling and thought about the incredible pressure, since the fight hadn't even started, but he was already gathering so much strength that his body trembled. However, a smirk appeared on his face. Then he questioned if he could defeat the 4 generals in the state he was in. Azurat looked back and realized that the other generals had retreated, hiding again behind the dry tree. The surprise made him question internally the reason for that. Meanwhile, the generals, observing from afar, just waited, determined to intervene only if they saw a real opportunity for victory. The idea of facing Kratos alone began to make Azurat nervous. Without warning, Zephyros intervened. With a firm voice, he declared that, according to the ancient tradition of demons, all battles should be to the death, with no possibility of surrender. The sudden formalization of the combat caught everyone off guard. Kratos reacted in panic, shocked by the speed with which everything unfolded. Azurat, equally desperate, tried to protest, but it was too late. Azurat firmly wielded his weapon, trying to contain the nervousness that threatened to invade his mind. He knew that his opponent was weakened and that this was his chance. Kratos, on the other hand, was seized by panic, unable to think clearly about what he should do. For a brief moment, he remembered the moment he had raised the throne with his own hands. When he did a strength test. In the end, he realized that he was strong, yes, but not strong enough to boast. Suddenly, Azurat advanced. His movement was fast. Kratos was caught by surprise, but in the next instant, something awakened in his mind. He knew he had seen that blow before, but he couldn't remember for sure. At the moment the blow was struck, Kratos managed to dodge. Even without immediately understanding how he had done it, the memory emerged. He had seen that movement before when he was playing. Kratos remembered that at the time of the attack, Azurat's left foot was turned outwards. It was a clear clue that the attack was a thrust. It was exactly the same movement he knew from the game. And that's what saved his life. Hartok commented to Sergei about Kratos' expression when dodging the attack, remembering how he seemed ready to counterattack and tear off the enemy's arm. Sergei questioned why he didn't do it and suggested they continue paying attention. Meanwhile, Azurat launched another attack, and once again Kratos dodged with precision. He began to question internally what was happening, noting that all of Azurat's movements were exactly the same as in the game. The memory took him back to when he was still human, playing as aged Kimchi, and his character had to fight Azurat for the first time in that game. At that moment he had been completely impressed. He wondered if that enemy could really be defeated. He was fast, applied offbeat blows, and still had a wide range of attacks. He had died several times. He only managed to defeat him for the first time on the 128th attempt. In the next 19 playthroughs, however, he managed to completely turn the game around, to the point of humiliating him with a streak of victories without suffering a single blow. Azurat launched another attack against Kratos, but again without success. Kratos, while dodging with ease, felt a growing joy. His face radiated an insane happiness, mocking Azurat's frustration, whose blows could not hit him. The other 3 generals began to worry. They realized that Kratos was not only at an advantage but seemed to enjoy the situation, laughing at Azurat's futile effort and feeding on the opponent's humiliation. As Azurat clenched his teeth in frustration, Kratos experienced a sense of relief. Although he still knew that this did not mean guaranteed victory, something essential had ignited in his mind. He had understood that that world followed the same rules as the game he understood well. At that exact moment, a translucent blue window appeared before him with a clear message, identifying him as Kim Jang-cheol and confirming that he had understood one of the fundamental rules of that world. Surprised, he observed the floating balloon. It was like those he used to see in webtoons. Soon after, a new message appeared, informing him that he had managed to dodge enemy attacks with high concentration. Azurat advanced at high speed, consumed by intense fury, aiming directly at Kratos. In the next instant, a new message appeared before Kratos' eyes, informing him that a part of the system reserved for playable characters had been unlocked. Soon after, another notification appeared, revealing that the aiming function had been activated. Surprised by the sudden change, Kratos realized that a mark had appeared in his field of vision, indicating exactly where he was looking. He immediately understood that it was the aim used for special abilities. Without hesitation, he began to scratch his own hands with his claws, making blood flow. Then, he threw the blood upwards, and a sphere of electricity appeared and hit Azurat squarely. The reaction was immediate. The generals, observing from a distance, showed surprise and tension. Demons around, who had already gathered to watch the combat, began to cheer and acclaim Kratos with enthusiasm. Azurat was on his knees before Kratos, the burned remains of his clothes barely covering his body marked by cuts that still sparked with traces of electricity. Smoke rose from his wounded skin. Kratos observed, surprised that he was still alive after the blow that, in the game, meant instant death. He knew that Azurat had extraordinary recovery and would soon regain his energy, which he could not allow. Without hesitation he launched the same ability repeatedly, giving no time for reaction. The impact of the attacks was so intense that the three generals watching from a distance trembled at the scene. For the demon generals, it was clear that Kratos was not trying to kill Azurat immediately, but rather to inflict pain that would prevent him from recovering. Azurat, now thrown to the ground, enveloped in smoke and completely vulnerable. And yet he did not die. Faced with the impasse, an unexpected notification appeared for Kratos. The system informed him that all of Azurat's clothes had been removed, leaving him completely naked. Surprise took over him when he realized the random and uncomfortable nature of the message. Before he could react, another notification appeared, informing him of the unlocking of a new system, the armor removal system from the inventory. Kratos opened the armor inventory on the floating screen that appeared before him, hoping to find something useful. However, he realized that there was only what he was already wearing, nothing else he could use at the moment. He turned his eyes to Azurat, assessing the situation, and concluded that he needed to get rid of him first. He knew he didn't have enough strength to kill him and that the opponent's regeneration capacity was high, so he would inevitably recover in some time. At that instant an idea occurred to him. Since Azurat was not yet dead, it was still possible to target him. He thought of continuing to fire his bloody attacks and had an epiphany. He would repeatedly use bloody blows and infuse the soil with large amounts of nitrogen. Upon realizing the viability of his plan, he felt overwhelmed by exaggerated confidence, convinced that he had found the perfect solution to the problem with the barren land. Kratos looked at the generals while his body trembled. He was convinced that the fear on their faces was because of him. He decided to put this idea to the test. He called Sergei and received confirmation that she was listening. Then he ordered her to tie Azurat firmly. Sergei was surprised and thought he was trying to humiliate both her and Azurat by making her tie up a naked man. The first step of the plan was to prepare the lightning rod. Azurat was tied with his arms outstretched to a log. He was unconscious until, suddenly, he awoke electrically as if taken by a discharge. His recovery was complete, and he exuded fury, certain that his enemy had weakened and determined to cut off his head. Kratos launched another bloody strike at Azurat, initiating the second stage of the plan. With this, he intended to oxidize the nitrogen in the air into nitrite. Then he addressed Hartok with a precise instruction. Hartok, confused for a moment, pondered the intention behind the request, considering that perhaps Kratos wanted to make the environment more humid to intensify the effects of the lightning. He found it creative and even instructive. Hartok then crossed his arms and began to generate the dense mist needed to cover the entire area. The third stage of the plan was to spread this mist, while the fourth was to repeat the attack. Kratos did not stop launching attacks, even with the intense pain caused by using his own blood. The generals watched in silence, impressed by the uninterrupted sequence of blows. Taken by an almost disturbing animation, Kratos reflected on the possibility of transforming that land into fertile soil with the infusion of nitrogen. The idea of an abundant harvest excited him, and he laughed as he continued launching more and more attacks. Mist, electricity, and blood mixed in a continuous spectacle. After some time he stopped the attacks and took a handful of earth in his hands. He judged that it was enough to continue with that methodology to enrich the soil with nitrogen. The next step would be to improve the quality of the land. He considered that loose, monovalent structured soil did not allow oxygen entry or water drainage. For cultivation, granular and crumbly soil would be ideal. Therefore he knew that what he needed to create now was fertilizer. Kratos turned to the generals and ordered everyone to bring shit. The three generals, who by then already had remnants of the blood shed by Kratos, froze at the order. For a moment they seemed not even to have understood what they had just heard. Then they reflected on the intention behind that absurd order. After making an example of Azurat and subjecting him to torture, now he wanted to dirty the demon with shit. That was unbelievably cruel. The scene changes to a vibrant forest, full of life and dense vegetation. Aged Kimchi walked in silence when he heard voices coming from behind a bush. Approaching cautiously, he found two men asking for help. One of them had a broken leg immobilized with sticks. He explained that they had been attacked by goblins. Both begged for help, promising rewards in return. Aged Kimchi just watched them in silence without giving any immediate response, which made them even more nervous. Despite saying he posed no danger, the two couldn't help but think that this stranger seemed anything but trustworthy. Without waiting for a reaction, Aged Kimchi approached the injured man and lifted him onto his shoulders. Then, he looked at the other man and indicated that he should lead the way. The man nodded and the three followed through the forest. During the journey, the injured man introduced himself as Rivage Asheran, an emissary, and introduced the other as his servant, Diol Frontera, and wanted to know who was helping them. Aged Kimchi's answer was simple and enigmatic. This was something he himself still needed to discover. Back at the demon stronghold, the trio of commanders appeared exasperated. Hartok questioned how they were expected to simply produce feces. He sarcastically suggested if they were meant to create it on demand. Sergi shouted in dismay, appalled, revolted, and clearly overwhelmed. She spiraled into panic. Bal admitted he hadn't eaten in a considerable time and thus couldn't contribute. He speculated that Sergi was equally incapable. She snapped at him, refusing to discuss such matters. Hartok, unwilling to donate his own waste, proposed a more aggressive solution, coerced the lower-ranked demons into providing it. Soon after, in a demonic village, a desperate creature pleaded with them not to proceed. The unfortunate soul protested that he couldn't relieve himself while being observed. He begged them to step outside. Another soldier retorted that similar requests had been made before, yet no progress had been achieved. Hartok grew impatient, demanding results. He confirmed with the demon that despite all effort, there would be no outcome. The creature confessed he hadn't eaten in days. Frustrated, Hartok seized the demon, summoning his power. He thanked the poor thing for the accidental inspiration. He attacked him, eliciting a painful cry. The assault was cut short when Bal intervened, gripping Hartok's wrist. Hartok asked what the interruption was for. Bal clarified that piercing the abdomen would be fatal, eliminating any chance of obtaining the needed material. He explained that the demons must remain alive to yield the waste required. Hartok released the demon and, surprisingly, praised Bal's insight, especially coming from someone like him. Yet, he followed with a threat, suggesting they feed the villagers Bal's flesh to stimulate production. Bal prepared to retaliate. The captive demon trembled as tensions escalated. Hartok and Bal were moments away from clashing when a powerful voice roared across the area, demanding an explanation. It was Kratos. A single application of bloody strike sent both to the ground. Infuriated, he reminded them that humans weren't the only beings capable of defecation. His irritation was palpable. He proceeded to inform them that excrement lacking nutritional substance held no utility. What they required was waste matter rich enough to serve as effective compost. Zephyros, perplexed, inquired about the meaning of compost. Kratos clarified that it referred to a component that delivers nourishment to the soil. Typically, such compost is formulated using wood ashes, unwanted vegetation, dirt, broken eggshells, and poultry droppings. For the ashes and weeds, they could repurpose the abandoned homes they had encountered earlier. The complication arose with sourcing eggshells and bird waste. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. He instructed Zephyros to fetch the territorial map. Once unrolled upon the surface of a table, it confirmed his suspicions. It was the identical layout he had encountered within the confines of the game. This meant that if he reached a specific location, he should be able to locate what he sought. He was referring to the nesting grounds of the infernal seabirds. In the game environment, flocks of them populated the area extensively. It implied that these creatures absorbed abundant nutrients from the lands of humans, and subsequently deposited both their excrement and eggs in that territory. Kratos considered it an ideal collection point. Zephyros hesitantly asked if the demon sovereign truly intended to gather waste from the seagulls. Kratos acknowledged the accuracy of the observation. Zephyros then disclosed the name of the area, the Cliff of No Return. There were no platforms or resting points, and anyone unfortunate enough to fall would be consumed by violent tides. Kratos confirmed that he was already aware of those hazards. The reason such a place was beyond player reach in the game was because it lacked systematic access. But in this reality he was confident in his ability to scale it. Upon arrival, the scene was unforgiving. Surging waves and towering stone columns dominated the surroundings. The commanders were bewildered by their liege's intentions. Many had attempted to hunt those seabirds in the past. Each endeavor had ended with the hunters succumbing to the sea's wrath. Kratos explained his strategy. He would ascend the cliff and hurl down a sack filled with excrement and eggshells. He commanded the generals to ensure it would be caught. If successful, everyone would have sustenance. Ball stood in silence. In his mind, he recalled the gaunt demon Hartok had strangled earlier, along with the emaciated figures lining the streets. The ocean's surges remained relentless. As Kratos prepared to leap, memories of his 13th playthrough surfaced. He had tried countless methods to reach the peak. Hundreds of failed attempts, dying repeatedly, had defined that journey. But now he leapt, watched intently by the generals and Zephyros. His self-assurance was unwavering, because he had conquered this obstacle before by exploiting a game-breaking flaw. Gripping a protruding rock, he held so tightly that an indentation formed in the cliff's surface. The commanders and Zephyros stared, astounded. Without delay, Kratos summoned his inventory and unequipped every article of clothing. The sight left them stunned. Only portions of his form, his hair, his flexed arm muscles, and his rear, were visible. The group struggled to contain their amusement at the absurd image. Kratos pushed his weight off the ledge, needing to rotate his torso. Sergi flushed and averted her face. Yet even as she turned, her eyes flicked back with thinly veiled curiosity. It became apparent, she harbored intrigue regarding the demon lord's anatomy. Kratos proceeded to rotate his form, once again removing all garments. His bare backside appeared again. Then he twisted and re-equipped his outfit. Once more he spun and disrobed, exposing himself. He repeated this cycle of rolling and equipping. With each motion upward, he advanced closer to the summit. The repeated appearance of his rear became almost comedic in nature. And at last he reached the top. He stood firmly atop the precipice, clothed and composed. Within a realm governed by a game-like structure, where equipment management and inventories operated like coded functions, and where boundaries marked unreachable zones on a virtual map, Kratos had pieced together all these elements. Through observation and trial, he became certain that reaching this forbidden edge was indeed within the realm of possibility. Ball, driven by the demon sovereign's promise of nourishment, resolved to lend his assistance. Zephyros grew alarmed by Baal's sudden initiative and attempted to halt him, but Baal had already launched himself forward, intent on following the monarch. Zephyros's cries drew Kratos' gaze. In a split second, Baal leapt, aspiring to emulate his liege. But the rocky surface offered no grip. Baal began to plummet. Thankfully, Kratos reached out and caught him mid-fall. At that moment, Kratos was bare-chested, only the upper portion of his form visible from behind the stone ledge, as he clung desperately to Baal's weight. To make it work, he needed to activate the same glitch that had allowed him passage earlier. His forearm veins bulged under the immense pressure. Baal's mass threatened to tear his limbs from their sockets. Inwardly, he questioned the rationale for saving someone like Baal, one of the 4 mighty generals who posed a potential danger to his rule. Wouldn't it be easier if the general simply ceased to exist? He voiced this internal conflict aloud, declaring that he held no obligation to rescue Baal. While gripping the general, Kratos' mind wandered back to a memory, a time when a peer, eyes red and voice cracking, had come to him for assistance. The professor had refused to accept this junior's paper, aiming instead to exploit the student endlessly for academic labor. The young man had pleaded with Kratos to speak with the professor, believing that the educator would heed the words of Jang Kyol, the most favored scholar. That youth had admired him. Since he was already serving as the top workhorse, perhaps the professor would be swayed. But fear had gripped him. He'd worried about jeopardizing his position, about placing himself in disfavor. So he told the boy that it wasn't his concern and walked away. And ever since he had wondered, what if he had stepped in? What if he had tried just a little harder? If he had pushed himself to his limits, perhaps the face that haunted him in memory would have worn a smile instead of despair. Now that same sensation welled up as Baal clung to him. In that moment of suspended peril, Kratos resolved to do what he hadn't done then. He clenched his jaw, braced himself, and shouted with all his might. His bones groaned under the strain. Summoning every ounce of his physical capability, he heaved the general upward, throwing Baal atop the cliff. The large figure crashed onto the stony surface. Meanwhile, Kratos cradled his fractured arm, pain evident in his posture. Baal, stunned, observed his sovereign's self-inflicted injury. The demon lord had risked his own well-being without necessity. Baal, overcome with emotion, questioned why. For a time, Kratos said nothing. Then, in quiet solemnity, he offered the reason. It was a choice that carried less pain than turning his back on those who relied on him and facing the regret of abandonment. Baal trembled. Moisture welled in his eyes. Within Kratos' thoughts, the act felt like redemption, something he should have done for that pleading junior. The regret of not assisting those in desperate need lingered in him, following him even across dimensions. At that poignant moment, a translucent system notification emerged. It stated that even while still not fully acclimated to the vessel of Demon King Kratos, he had exerted every fiber of strength. As a result, he had earned Baal's genuine gratitude, one of the four supreme commanders. Kratos became aware of the depth of that appreciation. To honor this milestone, the system activated a new feature. From now on, bestowing upon the army a shared sense of deep satisfaction would reward him with a substantial number of points. He reflected on the substantial quantity. The system promptly notified him that the happiness point, or HP, accumulation feature was now active. Kratos pondered what exactly a happiness point was. At first, he assumed it might be something akin to a discount coupon for frozen treats. The system, clearly irritated, rebuked his misunderstanding, questioning what kind of fantasy world would even offer ice cream. Startled by the system's direct and conversational tone, Kratos realized it could respond to his thoughts. It was then clarified that for every demon soldier who experienced satisfaction from a full belly, Kratos would earn a single happiness point. These points could then be used to enhance his attributes. At present, Kratos had access to merely a fifth of the Demon Lord's total strength. This revelation explained his relative weakness in comparison to his subordinates. The system encouraged him to develop all 5 of his attributes and strive to unlock the Demon Lord's full capabilities. Curious to try the function, Kratos attempted to increase his stamina by 10%. A notification appeared, explaining that the cost for such an upgrade would be 50 happiness points, a steep price in his view. The system further revealed that abilities could also be upgraded. His current skill, Bloodstrike, was only at its first tier and required a hefty 250 points to level up. Realizing the large quantity of points he'd need, Kratos reasoned that through effective farming, he could steadily accumulate HP and thereby greatly enhance his strength and improve his odds of survival. In addition to this revelation, he received something else: gratitude. With a sly grin, he quietly enjoyed the rare feeling. From Baal's perspective, however, the expression worn by the Demon Lord was far from comforting. It seemed to communicate a silent threat, a reminder that a debt had been formed and defiance would not end well. To Baal, Kratos appeared as a ruthless leader, one who didn't save lives out of compassion. Shortly after, the demon sovereign lifted a large eggshell and summoned the others' attention. He declared his intent to fill the shell with organic waste and toss it toward them. The trio stood frozen in disbelief, entirely unsure how to respond. As promised, the Demon Lord launched the container, its contents flung toward the stunned group. The unexpected barrage caused uproar. They had no time to react. It was quite literally a storm of filth. The 3 generals were overwhelmed, certain they had reached their limits. Meanwhile, Kratos believed this was only the beginning. He demanded full dedication to agriculture. The essential elements of natural fertilizer, seabird droppings, fragmented eggshells, scorched wood remnants, and properly tilled soil, needed to be blended thoroughly. He summoned Sergi for this task and instructed her to pulverize and combine the materials. Sergi was dumbfounded. The command seemed beneath her station. Despite her numerous limbs, which made her ideally suited for the work, she was incensed. Proclaiming her status as the frigid monarch, she armed herself, stating that her appendages were not intended for menial duties like compost preparation. However, the intense gaze of Kratos silenced her. He offered an alternative, a simpler task. He directed her attention toward Azurat, who still emitted faint wisps of smoke from the electric blasts he had received. All she had to do was remain in place. A straightforward job, no? Thus, the regal monarch of ice became an unwilling mixer of compost. Rumor suggested she remained in that role to this day. Internally, Kratos was close to losing composure. He reminded himself that these generals were all volatile, and one misstep could easily end in disaster. But then he reminded himself of his position. He was the demon sovereign. With nothing but determination and brute resolve, he would press forward. The next phase in producing the fertilizer had arrived, the application of moisture. He summoned Hartok and instructed him to saturate the air with mist. However, Hartok raised objections to this directive, arguing that the resulting humidity would intensify the already unbearable stench. He had no desire to carry out such a revolting command. Then, Kratos revealed his trump card once more. His eyes landed squarely on Azurat. No one was eager to serve as a living conduit for electricity, so Azurat swiftly soared through the surroundings, dispersing dampness across the atmosphere. Kratos then consulted Baal to confirm whether the level of moisture sufficed. Baal acknowledged that the consistency had softened with the addition of water, just as their ruler had anticipated. At last, the third stage called for the compost to be relocated to a shaded, arid location and layered with a covering fashioned from seagull plumage. Yet a challenge loomed. The demon lord knew that even producing a small quantity of this material would demand considerable time. To generate enough fertilizer for the expanse of terrain before him, he recognized that a full-scale mobilization of demonic manpower would be unavoidable. His expression hardened. Something troubled him, but it was an obligation he couldn't ignore. Kratos resolved to proceed under the authority granted by his crown. Later that evening, elsewhere within the dominion of demons, a modest wooden shelter came into view. Inside, two infernal beings resided. One reclined upon a makeshift bed. The figure lying down was a young female demon named Flute. She called out to her father, who inquired softly what had happened. Tears welled in her eyes as she offered a heart-wrenching suggestion, that her father should simply consume her. Outraged, the father rebuked the idea vehemently. He reminded her never to utter such despair again. But the girl, still mourning the absence of her mother, insisted, and her words struck deeper than any wound. Then a flashback unfolded. A monstrous demonic beast had once attempted to devour the child. She had cried out for aid, and just before the gaping maw reached her, a figure emerged, shielding her fragile body. It had been her mother. Without time to react, the maternal figure was swallowed whole, sacrificing herself to spare her daughter. In the present, her father spoke gently, explaining that without her, he would have no reason to keep living. Their somber exchange was disrupted by noises outside. The presence of Kratos and his subordinates had arrived. Flute's father froze, overwhelmed at the sight of the demon lord himself, his voice trembling uncontrollably. Hearing his reaction, Kratos concluded the demon still had vitality and thus issued the order for his capture. The father pleaded, explaining that there was no one else to care for his child, and if left alone she might fall prey to more powerful demons. Flute sobbed, begging them to release her father, but the demon lord remained unmoved. He then turned to Zephyros inquiring about the current count. Zephyros confirmed they had secured 20 demons and required 30 more to meet their goal. As Kratos turned to leave the residence, his eyes once again rested on the girl. She continued to cry, believing she was about to lose another parent. Inside the game she had been featured as a berserk adversary, a demon child driven mad. He had frantically tapped his controller, initiating a rapid slash to eliminate her. The look in her eyes now was identical to the one from that moment, and it momentarily stirred something inside him. But he was the Demon King and emotion had no place in policy. Maintaining his stoic demeanor, he issued one final decree before departing. He commanded the cessation of all cannibalistic behavior among the demon kin. He also directed Zephyros to assemble the remaining infernal beings and order every one of them to begin working on fertilizer production immediately. At last, the protagonist fully accepted the mantle of leadership, and with it the accompanying burdens and trade-offs. Several days later, the demon inhabitants who had been conscripted had already begun to labor diligently across the fields. Wielding their weapons as crude tools, they turned over the composted earth. Among them, Flute's father, now known as Dyrok, voiced his skepticism. He questioned the value of this toil, convinced that their exertions over the past few days were fruitless. The notion of agriculture to him seemed utterly absurd. A companion cautioned him to be careful with such statements, warning that they could cost him his head. But Dyrok stood resolute, maintaining that regardless of what happened, their fate was already sealed. Even if the terrain became arable, they still lacked any viable crops to sow. As if summoned by the critique, Kratos materialized and addressed the doubt directly, posing a rhetorical question about the future of their planting efforts. Dyrok immediately recognized that he had spoken out of turn and was now in jeopardy. The Demon King instructed him to come along. What Dyrok was unaware of was that Kratos had already identified a potential answer days prior. On the very occasion he had faced opposition from his high-ranking officers, a particular violet blossom had caught his eye. He had instantly recognized it as a candidate for cultivation. And so, he guided Dyrok to stand before this same flower. Kratos informed him that they would be planting the roots of this plant. Baal and a segment of the agricultural unit had already retrieved samples from different areas. Dyrok, now unnerved, humbly explained that the root of this flower was inedible, capable of inducing severe stomach agony, even fatal consequences. The demon sovereign then tugged the flower from the ground, stating plainly that this was the only resource at their disposal. The trial to determine its edibility should have concluded by now, he added. Dyrok was stunned by the revelation. his composure nearly shattered. In a state of panic, Dyrok raced to his daughter's side, crying out in desperation. He questioned the demon lord's morality, demanding to know why such a cruel experiment had been inflicted upon an innocent child. He pleaded for his daughter to be spared from ingesting the roots. Barging into their home, Dyrok halted abruptly at what he witnessed. Flute, appearing far healthier than before, was cheerfully consuming the roots without discomfort. Dyrok, trembling, asked in disbelief if she truly felt fine. Flute affirmed that she did. She also mentioned that both Zephyros and Baal had fed her the same food the previous day, and she hadn't experienced any ill effects. At that moment, Kratos re-entered the scene and inquired whether Dyrok had now come to trust him. In the past, Kratos explained, there had been humans from a distant region who had also managed to transform this very toxic vegetation into a safe food source. They succeeded in growing it and overcame their hunger crises. With a wicked grin stretching across his face, the Demon King unveiled the truth, that this very plant was now recognized in the human realm as the potato. Flute looked up and sincerely expressed her gratitude, thanking Kratos for his compassion toward someone as insignificant as her. At that instant, a translucent prompt manifested before the Demon King. The system had taken note. A portion of the demon population was now content from being well-fed, and Kratos had earned his first happy point. The counter increment, 1 point added. A display showed the current tally of HP. Kratos was genuinely taken aback by the notification. He looked once more at Flute, who beamed with genuine warmth. Then a memory surfaced, a recollection from when he had been merely a player. It was that same Flute, rendered within the game, a naive demon child who had been coerced into doing terrible things just to survive. The image back then starkly contrasted with what stood before him now. A faint smile crept across Kratos' face. He acknowledged to himself that, as a demon lord, perhaps he didn't always need to wear a stern mask. He smiled, awkwardly, perhaps grotesquely. But it was a real smile. Internally, he mused that a little demon like her just needed to eat well and grow up strong. Unfortunately, this sentiment was wholly misunderstood. His attendants misread his intentions, interpreting the look on his face as sinister. Baal, in particular, assumed the Demon King had ulterior motives, that he was merely fattening the girl up to devour her later. To him, Kratos was the embodiment of a truly malevolent monarch. Yet, unbeknownst to them, the expression Kratos had revealed was the one he had always hoped others would see, though it could not have been further from the truth. Following those events, it was revealed that the most remote location within the expansive dominion governed by the Demon Lord bore the name Chavain de Antir. The entire region was segmented into 5 distinct sectors, and this frigid expanse lay within the most secluded one. Temperatures plunged to icy extremes by nightfall, only to surge into sweltering heat during daylight, a climatic pattern reminiscent of the high-altitude terrain of the Andean Plateau. In historical accounts, inhabitants of the Andes often faced food shortages, leading them to consume wild tubers laced with toxins. But did such desperation lead to extinction? On the contrary, humankind exhibited a remarkable talent, the ability to transform harmful provisions into digestible sustenance. That very human ingenuity was now being emulated by Jeshiel, now recognized as Kratos, the reigning demon sovereign. Soon after, Dirac appeared and informed the Demon King that the tuberous roots had already been positioned across the cultivated terrain. In response, Kratos instructed Baal to pulverize them. Without hesitation, Baal launched himself high into the air, landing with tremendous force to smash the roots beneath his immense weight. Under such crushing pressure, those potatoes stood no chance of remaining whole. Baal's task was far from over, as he would be repeating this action throughout the entire day. Kratos had devised a meticulous process. The roots were to be frozen under the cold night sky for 5 consecutive evenings. Then, under the scorching heat of the day, they would be softened and subjected to Baal's powerful impact. This repetition, freezing, thawing, pounding, would extract the poisonous content and allow it to dissipate. Once this cycle had been executed enough times, the remnants would be dried, preserved, and lightly heated for consumption. Thus was created the demon realm's version of chunyo, wild potatoes rendered edible through careful preparation. The narrative returned to Kratos, who summoned Zephyros and instructed him to assemble the group of demons assigned to fertilizer production. Wearing a wicked grin, the demon lord declared that it was time for a break, snack time to be precise. He anticipated that his underlings would savor the food. As distribution commenced, the demons formed a queue, awaiting their share. Kratos announced that only 2 pieces would be allotted per individual due to limited supply. Zephyros, noting the sizable reserve of processed potatoes, inquired whether additional portions could be produced. Kratos expressed skepticism, stating that the remaining quantity wasn't sufficient to nourish the entire legion. Instead of consuming all of them, he planned to replant the tubers, allowing them to multiply exponentially. Moments later, as the wild potato portions were distributed, hesitation filled the air. The farming squad looked uneasily at the unfamiliar food, memories of lost kin weighing heavily. Dyrok stepped in, reassuring them that the Demon King had neutralized the toxic effects and that the roots were now safe for consumption. However, a particularly eccentric demon with a bizarre haircut mocked Dyrok, calling him naive. He gestured toward Kratos, describing him as a sinister figure who wouldn't distribute food without an ulterior motive, likely intending to poison them. Yet Dyrok remained undeterred. He boldly took a bite of the food. All eyes followed his chewing, their tension growing until he casually swallowed it. With tears brimming in his eyes, he shouted praise for the Demon King. The rest of the laborers, observing Dyrok's survival, promptly devoured their portions as well. And soon a second line formed, they eagerly sought more. Dyrok, basking in his moment of vindication, was filled with pride. It was true, the Demon Lord had genuinely provided them with edible nourishment. The odd-haired demon, now swayed, began to lead a chant. Raising his left arm, he bellowed with enthusiasm, "Yes, Kratos." The Demon King, however, was unimpressed by the awkward slogan and silently resolved to replace that ridiculous cheer at a later date. Off to the side, Zephyros studied Kratos' expression. He noted that the Demon Lord's countenance reflected unwavering belief that even in this barren wasteland, he would produce viable food. In that gaze, Zephyros sensed the possibility that Kratos might indeed be the one to finally end the cycle of starvation and despair that plagued their kind. At that very moment, the interface reappeared. A system notification declared that a segment of Kratos' forces was content due to having eaten. This time, the tally rose by 50 happy points, a reward for successfully feeding 50 members of the agricultural squad. The new cumulative total displayed boldly: HP equals 51. The protagonist observed the unfolding scene with visible amusement. A subtle grin crept across his face as he internally acknowledged that the total number of points accrued so far was quite respectable. With this accumulation, he could now afford to bolster his strength a bit. However, a decision had yet to be made on which attribute would be prioritized. At the moment, he remained uncertain. Perhaps it would be more prudent to continue stockpiling points for the time being. While he contemplated dividing labor between the fertilizer production group and the wild potato extraction team, Zephyros began to rally the attention of the field workers. The astute assistant had devised a plan to spread word throughout the village that a consumable crop could now be cultivated even in this desolate terrain. An incentive was offered. Any demon who unearthed wild potatoes would receive food coupons redeemable for chunyo. The announcement stirred celebration among the farming squad, while Kratos quietly evaluated Zephyros. He mused that the subordinate was every bit as clever as he appeared. Despite his irritating personality, he was undeniably one of the most resourceful allies in the group. Thanks to this campaign, the village demons diligently scoured the earth, unearthing every last wild potato. Meanwhile, fertilizer grinder Sergi and artificial precipitation specialist Hartok remained hard at work, each fulfilling their respective assignments. Lastly, Aserat, still securely restrained, awaited his next relocation. Kratos had merely been shifting the location where his living lightning conductor would be positioned. Upon determining the most suitable area, preparations were finalized. The Demon Lord then proceeded to discharge a series of electric bolts upon the familiar target, harnessing Aserat's endurance for the benefit of nitrogen enrichment. He truly toiled to ensure proper soil infusion. With fertilizer production reaching adequate levels, it was time to commence the subsequent phase, distributing the compost uniformly across the terrain. However, the sheer size of the land posed a significant challenge. The territory was far too extensive for a malnourished workforce sustained by only a few morsels of chunyo. Suddenly, Aserat summoned the strength to plead with the Demon Lord, asking for death to be swift. Yet the request was ignored. Instead, another jolt was sent his way. In Kratos' mind, eliminating an individual capable of remaining operational even while famished, all thanks to his regeneration trait, was foolish. He considered it a free source of nitrogen after all. Still, the dilemma of territorial expansion lingered. The Demon King pondered whether reinforcements were the only viable solution. He had previously instructed Zephyros to send requests for aid to the Star Masters. In the message, Zephyros had penned a firm directive: all offensive actions must cease, and manpower should be redirected toward agricultural development. Although this appeal had been dispatched to every sector within the star region, no replies had been received. Kratos found this worrisome. He even speculated whether the courier had perished from hunger before reaching any recipients. A serious problem loomed if farmland expansion could not proceed swiftly. Elsewhere, in the realm of the demons, the first star zone, named the Cliff of the Dead, harbored its own developments. A servant knelt before his superior, relaying a reconnaissance report. Demon Lord Kratos had genuinely begun agricultural operations and seemed to have succeeded in creating edible sustenance. The master of this domain sighed, attributing Kratos' actions to fear, specifically fear of himself. This sinister figure, one whose power amplified with each demon's demise, interpreted Kratos' agricultural efforts as a tactic to halt both warfare and famine, thereby slowing his own growth. This elderly, Zeus-like entity was Saruthal, overseer of the first star region and commonly referred to as the Father of the Dead. It was disclosed that his subordinate had already intercepted and eliminated the messengers dispatched to the other star sectors. In essence, the appeals for aid had been silenced, reaching no one beyond Saruthal's domain. The ruthless overlord was resolute: demons must perish from starvation. Only then would their corpses serve as nourishment for him and his forces. Saruthal declared his intent to exterminate Kratos and claim the demon throne for himself. He issued a critical mission to his adjutant, Ficamir. The order was simple yet grave: annihilate every vestige of Kratos' agricultural progress. With an ominous tone, Saruthal formally proclaimed war. Ficamir, ignited by the opportunity for conflict, bristled with excitement. Back at the location of the designated living lightning conductor, Aserat shuddered as a biting gust swept through the area. Ficamir eventually disclosed his presence. He remarked that Kratos was exceptionally cruel for reducing Aserat to a breathing husk, merely to serve as a deterrent to others. He then reassured Aserat not to fret, explaining that his superior, Saruthal, appreciated his fierceness and would gladly welcome him once Kratos was eliminated. Ficamir summoned his elite unit, phantasmal entities known as wraiths. With manic enthusiasm, he bellowed a command to obliterate the barren land beyond repair. The spectral soldiers lost no time and gleefully embarked on their destructive rampage. One of them stumbled upon the compost scattered across the ground, and in his typical cluelessness, Ficamir instructed them to fling the waste across the terrain, cackling in delight. He reasoned that the enemy might attempt to reclaim and reuse the manure, so it should be evenly distributed to prevent retrieval. With blind zeal, the wraiths dutifully worked the material into the earth, dispersing it so thoroughly that no visible traces remained. Ficamir's unhinged laughter echoed, while Aserat watched the ridiculous display with an expression of disbelief and silence. He could only exhale in resignation. He recalled Kratos' exact instructions about finely grinding the manure and mixing it deep into the land. Ironically, this very task was now being accomplished by Ficamir, who remained blissfully unaware of his contribution. In Aserat's mind, a lingering question arose: what exactly are these fools trying to accomplish? The following morning, just before sunrise, one wraith commented on the endless nature of their assignment. Nevertheless, his peers remained tirelessly committed to their labor. When he voiced his complaint, he was promptly scolded for slacking. They operated under the belief that if even a single corner remained untouched, the demon king Kratos would transform it into farmland. The indolent wraith then questioned why wraith number 2718, notorious for his laziness, was especially diligent on that day. The numbered wraith confessed to his typical slothful tendencies but noted that something felt different this time. Observing the meticulously worked earth, he admitted feeling pride, as though he had contributed to something meaningful. The lazy wraith was left dumbfounded. After clicking his tongue in annoyance, he declared that he too would be a fool for the day. He resumed tilling beside the others. Unexpectedly, the scene took a turn. So focused were the wraiths on their exertions that they lost track of time. When dawn broke, they had failed to retreat, and all perished beneath the morning sun. Yet they passed with contentment, gratified by their efforts. The once empty fields were now cultivated with purpose. All phantoms in the expanse had faded, except for Ficamir. With tears welling in his eyes, he mourned his comrades, proud of their dedication. He silently wished their souls would find repose and wondered with solemn anticipation how Kratos would respond to their unintended accomplishment. Elsewhere, within the barn where the harvested potatoes were stored, Kratos could be heard murmuring about how tilling had taken more time than anticipated. Gazing at the dormant vegetables, he explained to Zephyros that potatoes in such a state wouldn't sprout, rendering immediate planting ineffective. He likened the condition to a tuber peacefully resting underground, abruptly yanked out by its stem, thrown into shock and left biologically frozen. Deep in contemplation, Kritos considered that dormancy could be interrupted more rapidly by storing the potatoes at 4 degrees Celsius for 2 to 3 weeks before transferring them to a warmer, darker location. He intended to request Sergi's aid in cooling them with her frost-born magic, but she was fuming with rage at present. Hartok likewise was currently unreliable. Kritos knew that provoking both simultaneously could be perilous, so an alternative solution was necessary. As a last resort, the Demon King had even instructed the farming squad to perform physical drills near the potato cache, in the hopes that their body heat might hasten the warming process. They all ended up exhausted rather quickly, rendering that strategy a failure as well. Thus the issue remained unresolved. Left with few alternatives, Kritos resolved to head over to the farmland and attempt whatever measures he still could. His focus narrowed to at least enriching the earth with nitrogen. A short while later, Kritos stood silently before the completely turned and fertilized soil. The ground had been thoroughly tilled and integrated. The pungent odor hung thick in the air, so intense that Aserat lost consciousness from the fumes. The demon lord stood stunned, speechless at the sight of the now prepared fields. He questioned internally how such a feat had come to pass, suspecting a miracle. Suddenly, an oblivious figure burst into laughter, the same fool who had unknowingly contributed to the miracle. He cackled in triumph, declaring their success, but his gloating was short-lived. Baal, looming behind him, lifted him effortlessly and presented him to the demon lord. This individual was none other than Ficamir, who had attempted to remain hidden. Kritos recognized him immediately as one of the notorious bosses from the Cliff of the Dead. He speculated that Ficamir might have arrived as backup. Without delay, Kritos demanded to know the reason for Ficamir's presence, a question that caused the demon to tense in panic. Just as Ficamir opened his mouth to reply, a swift blow from Kritos interrupted him. Zephyros, bewildered, questioned why the demon lord would strike before hearing a response. Kritos clarified that the act of withholding information was already suspicious enough, and sometimes brute force was the most effective interrogation tool. Ficamir, though pained, conceded that this approach was to be expected from the Demon King. Still, the demon remained tight-lipped, until he was subjected to a relentless barrage of punches. Blow after blow rained down. Eventually, Kritos himself grew winded. Ficamir lay motionless, barely conscious. Then, a prompt from the system materialized, reminding Kritos of his ability to enhance attributes using accumulated HP. With 51 points available, he invested in boosting his stamina. Refreshed, he resumed pummeling the unfortunate demon with renewed vigor. Thousands more strikes followed. In this act of merciless interrogation, Kritos demonstrated his fitness for the role of Demon King. Ultimately, Ficamir broke. He confessed not only his actions but the plot to eliminate Kritos altogether. The scheme traced back to Saruthal, who had deliberately severed the flow of reinforcements. The goal was to grow stronger as more demons starved. Zephyros remarked that such sabotage amounted to insurrection. He advised Kritos that eliminating Saruthal would send a clear message to those protesting the halted expeditions. However, Kritos recognized that even if he succeeded in taking Saruthal down, other adversaries would persist. What he truly required was a definitive method to overcome them. Zephyros warned that Saruthal was no ordinary enemy. Kritos was already aware. Saruthal possessed a spectral ability, allowing his body to shift into an incorporeal form. Even within the game, Saruthal had been a constant menace on the intricate terrain of the Cliff of the Dead, transforming the entire encounter into an elaborate pursuit. Still, Kritos had already begun formulating a plan. As in the game, if exterminating pests was impossible due to their concealment, the answer was simple: extract them from their den. Elsewhere, Flute found herself standing before Aserat. She looked upward timidly. The mere sight of her nearby presence visibly irritated him. She initiated a hesitant conversation, lowering her head in gratitude. She expressed thanks for his sacrifice as it was the reason they now had sustenance. However, praise directed toward a demon for noble deeds was considered deeply offensive. Aserat seethed. He accused Flute of derision and threatened her life. Frightened, Flute fled. With a burning glare, Aserat issued a vow, one drenched in fury. The moment he escaped, he would hunt Kritos down and destroy him. His moment of solace was abruptly interrupted as a chorus of demonic voices rose in melody directed toward him. From a distance, his gaze locked onto Credos approaching with a waving banner. As the image grew clearer, the banner's inscription came into view. Congratulations. Second conductor of thunder in the department. Alongside him was Ficamir, trussed up identically to Asarat. This unhinged entourage chanted jubilant hymns, as if commemorating the induction of a fresh recruit into their labor force. The agricultural detachment was gradually expanding its membership. Asarat mulled over the title of second conductor of thunder. Moisture welled in his eyes at the hopeful prospect of being released. The thought of finally being spared from being a perpetual spit-roasted avian stirred deep longing. Yet within moments, Ficamir was merely positioned adjacent to him. No soul even considered unfastening him from the pole. With fervor, Credos erupted into bellows, activating his sanguine surge technique. Asarat's stomach dropped as the full weight of reality set in. Credos intended for both of them to share the burden of lightning absorption. The pair, defeated in spirit, yielded to their fate. All the while, Saruthal observed from afar through his scrying orb. The notorious overlord shrieked with horror as his elite subordinate, Ficamir, was officially baptized as the next electro-grilled minion. The unsightly, celibate demon monarch persisted, unleashing strike after strike. Ficamir's wails echoed, his form writhing under the surges. Saruthal wept for his underling's torment. Still, Credos showed no mercy. The thunder cracked. Ficamir's cries escalated, almost indistinguishable from unholy moans. He was beginning to show signs of perverse enjoyment. Surveying this grotesque display, Saruthal howled in protest. At that very instant, Credos turned his attention sideways. There hovered the familiar reconnaissance specter from the game, a spectral avian clenching a crystal globe. This confirmed Saruthal's active surveillance. Rage simmered anew within Credos. His adversary had not only sabotaged his crops, but was now watching with contemptuous amusement. He vowed to ensure Saruthal rued the day he meddled. By morning, young Fluck was seen burrowing around in the earth. Asarat monitored her from his constrained vantage point. He noticed the roughened texture of her palms. The roasted warrior questioned her motives. She meekly explained her desire to assist. After all, the Demon King, the 4 exalted generals, and every grown-up were toiling tirelessly in the fields. She longed to contribute. Asarat scoffed, branding her a naive, low-tier demon child. He grumbled that the idiot tethered beside him had already cultivated the patch she was digging. He suggested she direct her efforts somewhere useful. Hearing that, Fluck beamed with gratitude. She extended heartfelt thanks to Ficamir for tilling the field and offering himself as an additional lightning conduit. Ficamir's eyes glistened. Her words moved him. Suddenly the agony felt worthwhile. Asarat muttered under his breath that the man had officially gone off the rails. He mocked their agricultural ambitions in this forsaken land. He pointed out that the absurd potato they were trying to raise hadn't even sprouted. According to him, unless the spud cellar was warmed, no buds would grow. He predicted starvation. Fluck took that statement to heart and dashed away, almost skipping with determination. Asarat rolled his eyes, convinced that a feeble demon like her couldn't change anything. At high noon, Zephyros expressed subtle unease about the demon monarch's scheme. He suspected that Saruthal was surely aware of their ambush. He doubted the commander would risk showing up to rescue Ficamir. Credos, however, expected no such thing. He anticipated Saruthal would dispatch underlings first. The goal was to decimate every single one of them, to force Saruthal's hand. He commanded his forces to ensure no survivors remained. The cultivator battalion now stood sentinel around the second lightning pillar. As the reconnaissance wraith soared above, Saruthal sneered at Credos' strategy. He believed this idle vigil would prove fruitless. While admitting it was unfortunate for Ficamir, Saruthal remained fixated on one objective, crippling the harvest. He deployed his crop wraiths. And for the surprise of no one, they appeared at the heart of the potato deposit. Numerous reptilian phantoms emerged. Then, with no hesitation, the spectral invaders surged forward. Saruthal gave the directive to annihilate the entire stockpile of potatoes, ordering them to crush and obliterate every last one. The harvest phantoms stormed the storage barn. Unbeknownst to them, everything was unfolding exactly as Credos had foreseen. The crop specters found themselves startled. Positioned atop the structure, the demon sovereign awaited. With a sly grin curving his lips, Credos acknowledged their presence like a host welcoming guests to their final resting place. The ghostly intruders faltered, taken aback by the ambush. His mind drifted back to his initial encounter with these exact entities during his gaming days. Moments steeped in hopelessness. These were Saruthal's second-tier elite division. The greatest hazard lay in their tendency to swarm en masse. A mere touch from their incorporeal forms could trigger rapid aging in the afflicted. Worse still, they could replicate the skill sets currently equipped by their opponents. Truly an affliction. But Kratos, now seasoned in the mechanics of this world, had already calculated their downfall. With a vicious sneer, he declared his readiness to roast the first of them. Lightning-based implements were their kryptonite. The specters realized they had walked into a trap and began to withdraw. However, Kratos warned them that the real snare had only just begun. The ghouls glimpsed crimson streaks near the entryway, blood that Kratos had deliberately smeared the night before. Now activating the second tier of his technique, Kratos brought his palm crashing against the ground, unleashing arcs of electricity. The current surged along the blood channels until it reached the door, where it surged upward like a net of lightning. The move, known as wide-range crimson discharge, electrified the entire vicinity. In that moment, the crop wraiths resembled writhing motes, floating helpless. The strike landed, eliciting their silent shrieks, even though they possessed no vocal cords. With their resistance neutralized, physical strikes now became effective. Kratos summoned the Cultivation Regiment. These fierce warriors, long aching for battle, barreled into the fray with scythes and rakes so lethal they would intimidate any foe. Though outwardly unimpressive, these soldiers were secretly the most formidable units of the final battleground. With that knowledge, Kratos no longer considered the crop wraiths a threat. For the first time he felt like a cold, calculating apex demon ruler. He scanned the area for any lingering phantoms that had survived the barrage. Determined to personally finish them off, he prepared his next move. But a piercing cry shattered his focus. Fluck emerged from beneath the mountainous heap of potatoes. Her sudden appearance stunned Kratos. A spectral assailant locked onto her. Her father, locked in his own skirmish, was unable to reach her. Kratos, agitated by the chaotic unpredictability of it all, forced himself to prioritize. Eliminating as many fleeing phantoms as possible had to take precedence. Still, his eyes stayed fixed on Fluck. He knew the range of his crimson discharge wouldn't reach her position. In a desperate act, he hurled a potato toward the ghost. Of course he knew it was futile, but instinct took over. The vegetable bounced off the specter's head, which then caught it mid-air. To his astonishment, the tuber began to pulsate like a capturing sphere. A pink vortex enveloped it, and the creature's essence was absorbed into it. Then, poof, a faint sound echoed. The soul emerged from the potato and ricocheted toward the stockpile. Distracted, the remaining crop wraiths retreated unnoticed. Kratos blinked in disbelief at what had just occurred. The potato had sprouted. Suddenly, understanding dawned. These apparitions accelerated aging. They had inadvertently jump-started the dormant biological rhythm of the potatoes. Without pause, Kratos clasped Fluck in his arms. His gaze softened slightly as he offered her an expression of approval. Her body trembled. Turning to his militia, he summoned their attention. The time for drawing Saruthal out had ended. From now on they would take the initiative. An offensive approach would serve them better. Elsewhere, someone's eyes fluttered open. Confusion clouded their vision. The location was none other than lightning pole number 1. It was Asarat. His mind muddled, he pondered his own identity and purpose. The warm sunlight bathed his face, and he felt a fleeting moment of gratitude. Then his stomach let out a deep growl. He came to understand that, despite his condition, a deep yearning for existence still burned within him. His focus shifted when he heard his name being called. It was Fluck. She expressed her gratitude, explaining that thanks to his tip regarding potato sprouting, everything had turned out well. She had even received a generous supply of chunyo as a result. She went on, mentioning how Kratos had assembled a considerable force of agrarian warriors. Yet, by this point, Azarat was no longer registering her words. His entire attention had zeroed in on the food she carried. The moment he laid eyes on the edible chunyo in Fluck's possession, his mind unraveled. Overwhelmed by hunger, he fixated on the meal. Aware of his craving, Fluck attempted to feed him by tossing a piece his way. Unfortunately, the morsel struck him square in the eye. Letting out a sharp groan, he threatened the child in irritation. Apologizing, she tried again. This time, she launched 3 pieces simultaneously, hoping at least one would land correctly. One chunk successfully entered his mouth, while the other 2 landed on his eyes once more. Despite the pain, tears welled up in his eyes, not from sorrow but from the sheer flavor. As he chewed, the delight overwhelmed him. At that moment, a notification arrived for Kratos. A member of his demon legion had experienced joy. 1 happy point was added. His cumulative total now stood at 302. This puzzled Kratos slightly. With the latest batch of recruits who had eaten chunyo, the total should have been 300 demons and fluck. He couldn't quite figure out the identity of the extra source of happiness, but ultimately dismissed the thought. More points only meant more power, and he intended to conserve them for the upcoming raid on Sarathal. Rousing his troops, he ordered the cultivation warriors to press forward. With fervent energy he rallied them in the name of a prosperous yield. Hours passed until they reached the threshold of Sarathal's stronghold. Sarathal, foreseeing the assault, instructed his minions to sever the rope bridge. As the bridge collapsed, the phantoms mocked the approaching demons, ridiculing them with jeers. Their amusement didn't last long. Without hesitation, Kratos lunged across the chasm. Panic swept through the wraiths, until they realized he had miscalculated. He was plummeting. The phantoms erupted with laughter, calling him brainless for attempting such a reckless leap. Then the laughter died. They spotted fragments of his form embedded into the cliff face, once again with his posterior exposed. The ultimate glitch maneuver had been activated. The spirits flushed, blushing in discomfort. Slowly, Kratos began his ascent, turning once, turning again, revealing his backside with each twist. His expression remained grim and menacing. With a few more contortions, the demon lord reached the top. The specters, thoroughly unsettled, groaned in disgust. Kratos then gestured toward Zephyros, signaling the next phase of the operation. Zephyros gave a subtle nod in return. Kratos bolted inside. As per his calculated tactics, the food wraiths were expected to fear the potatoes. But by charging in unarmed and alone, he increased the odds they would fall for the trap. As predicted, Sarathal dispatched his food wraiths, believing the demon king lacked the cursed tubers. Any contact with him would be their triumph. The spectral attackers surged forward. Kratos initiated a concealed maneuver, his so-called quantum leap. A glitch-based strategy now branded with an impressive name. Once more his frame merged with the terrain, his posterior protruding as before. Then he vanished. The wraiths, unnerved, muttered about the bizarre nature of his movements, wondering when he gained the ability to phase through solid matter. They sensed him overhead. Lunging, they managed to grab hold of him. Victory seemed imminent, until he disappeared yet again. This marked the 19th occasion on which Kratos had executed this plan. He had memorized every crevice of the terrain. Having visualized the entire battlefield by combining all areas of enemy spawn from the game, he stood dead center, surrounded entirely by the food wraiths. Drawing in a breath, Kratos steadied himself. The phantoms believed he must be fatigued, even as the sovereign of demons. But Kratos declared internally that he no longer stood there as a ruler. He was a seasoned gamer. In the distance, Zephyros shouted the cue. He ordered the next step. From all directions the cultivation squad appeared, launching their weapons. Not balls but potatoes. The tubers struck the agricultural phantoms directly. Simultaneously, Kratos instructed them to commence cultivation efforts. A few more seconds passed, just enough to fully appreciate the grandeur of the moment. Initially, Zephyros harbored some uncertainty regarding the strategy, yet soon came to grasp that the demon sovereign had once again devised a flawless approach. Earlier, Kratos had informed him that while he lured the crop wraiths into a single confined location, Zephyros was to direct the cultivation sentries along a mapped-out route. Zephyros reviewed the diagram of a forsaken, ancient watercourse, nothing but a cul-de-sac, or so it appeared. Kratos insisted otherwise. He declared that something was indeed hidden there, a covert passage, one he had personally uncovered. Following his escape from the nightmarish cliff of the deceased, just before entering the ultimate zone, he had explored thoroughly and noticed something unusual. Despite the area appearing empty, the craftsmanship of the environment seemed deliberate. Then he observed an odd section on the stone wall. After slashing it with a blade, the wall shifted open. That's how the areas had been linked. The hidden corridor bridged the battlefield where the initial confrontation with Saruthal had occurred and the cavern deep beyond. At first, he hadn't been able to access it until he cleared the surroundings. Only then could he claim the elixir of metamorphosis. If such an artifact existed in the real realm, he was advised to retrieve it. The elixir was a distillation of numerous fallen fleshly souls. It could only be ingested once, with its exact effects unknown. Back in the present, the field hands rejoiced as they gathered the sprouted spuds. The sight of it implied they were ready to sow them. Flute's father thought tenderly of her and of how they might finally enjoy full meals. But witnessing all of this, Credo's features darkened. A memory surfaced. He once starved so severely that a kindly elder woman offered him food. She had even promised a hearty supper if he could just hold out a little longer. The next thing he remembered, an ambulance was parked nearby. That thought soured his expression. With that grim recollection fresh, he declared a statement that caused the workers to cheer. Anyone who interfered with their long-awaited nourishment would be utterly annihilated. Just then someone called out to the overlord. It was Baal, announcing his readiness to assist against Saruthal. Credos, however, ordered Baal to focus on carrying the provisions. Combat belonged to the head of the chain. Meanwhile, Saruthal invoked the great spirit of glacial heart. He beseeched it to ensnare more souls with its frozen wrath and grant him a surge of reinforcements and might. Out of nowhere, Credos landed a forceful kick square into his back, sending him to the ground. Saruthal lay stunned, face against the dirt, shocked by the Demon King's sudden arrival. Credos coldly responded that it was no longer his concern. Pest extermination was now underway. As Saruthal remained crouched, Credos loomed above. The former rebuked Credos, branding him foolish to believe he could triumph single-handedly. Saruthal's form began to morph. He disclosed his genuine prowess. Despite the dramatic transformation, Credos showed no reaction. His expression was blank, almost disinterested, for he had witnessed this countless times, 19 to be exact. In past playthroughs, while chasing the ever-fleeing Saruthal across the hazardous cliffs, aged Kimchi's player frequently ran into his minions. By the end, nearly every creature inhabiting those bluffs had been eradicated. Eventually, Saruthal retreated into the chamber containing the Heart of Ice Spirit. A fearsome relic, allegedly forged from the death of an ancient drake, it unleashed a chilling energy that ensnared wandering phantoms in the land of the living. Saruthal made attempts to summon additional allies using the relic's force, but the paladin always arrived in time for the final confrontation. There, Saruthal activated his most formidable power. He conjured a whirling gale, signifying his acceptance of Credo's formidable nature. Gradually, the vortex assumed shape, an exact replication of Credos himself. Saruthal was convinced this was the key to victory. Credos knew all too well what was happening. Saruthal's signature ability allowed him to flawlessly duplicate his adversary's attributes and embody them. That was the climax of the encounter. At that moment, Saruthal possessed identical statistics to Credo's own character, which were maximized to their limits. With staggering offensive capacity and a near-untouchable evasion trait, even a single misstep meant instantaneous defeat. Nonetheless, the attributes that Saruthal replicated were from the current demon monarch Credos, whose prowess was no longer as formidable. Saruthal lunged forward. Simultaneously, Credos received a prompt to utilize his HP to acquire various attribute enhancements. He had the option to allocate 10% more to his existing stamina, which stood at 30%, as well as his psychological fortitude, bodily power, nimbleness, and arcane energy, each resting at 20%. With a reserve of 302 HP, Credos spent 50 of them to elevate his agility to 30%. Saruthal was taken aback when Credos sidestepped his strike with ease. Following that, Credos delivered a punch with all the force he could summon. Another 50 points were consumed to boost his brute force from 20% to 30%. He met Saruthal's clenched fist directly with his own. The impact prompted Saruthal to cry out in pain, bewildered as to how Credos remained unscathed. Credos retorted that cultivating land also required intellect. Enraged, Saruthal attempted to unleash the bloody strike technique, but Credos had already invested 50 points to amplify his magical force, raising it to 30%, and another 50 to augment his mental endurance to the same level. Both unleashed their lightning-based abilities. Saruthal was caught by surprise as his spell backfired, and he was struck by his own electrical discharge. The so-called Zeus impersonator began to liquefy, reduced to a viscous pool. His form now resembled that of gelatinous goo. At that moment, Credos was informed that he had expended his HP to elevate all of his core attributes to a uniform level of 30%. Then, a notification appeared. His development quest was now fulfilled. As a consequence, a fresh ability had become accessible. Summon Farmer's Throne, which required 100 HP to unlock. This throne, a clear homage to Game of Thrones, was armed with an array of sturdy agricultural instruments. Credos found the timing fortuitous, as he was in need of superior equipment. Even as a puddle, Saruthal still had the ability to speak. He addressed Credos, questioning whether he believed the battle had concluded. Credos responded in the negative. He was well aware that all second-phase encounters had a follow-up transformation. Saruthal's mass shifted again, now transforming into an archaic, malevolent dragon. He claimed that this was his true origin. Kratos was stunned. Witnessing it firsthand, the creature's offensive capability and reservoir of vitality were staggering. But it was expected. Saruthal served as the boss directly preceding the game's ultimate antagonist. Kratos, however, felt no dread. That was precisely when Baal and the agricultural enforcers arrived. He informed Saruthal that he had already emerged from the final stage himself. Then he issued a challenge. What could Saruthal possibly do now? Saruthal froze. Overwhelmed by the sight of reinforcements, he began to panic. He pleaded for a conversation to negotiate. But his appeal came too late. The farm enforcers stormed toward him, impelled by their yearning for a successful yield. They unleashed their accumulated frustration on Saruthal for disrupting their tilling. Saruthal begged for leniency. Kratos recognized that he could overcome Saruthal through direct combat, but the entity's capacity for speech and motion gave him pause. It didn't feel right to destroy it with his own hands. Still, he observed that his comrades were too malnourished to land efficient strikes. They had been battering Saruthal for some time now, yet he refused to perish. He contemplated a more effective tactic. Kratos activated the Summon Farmer's Throne skill, draining 100 HP and leaving him with just 2 points. A beam of verdant luminescence descended from the heavens, slowly lowering the throne. Then, without warning, it plummeted with explosive velocity. Kratos flinched in astonishment. The throne landed squarely atop Saruthal, generating a crater upon impact. The farm guards exulted. One demon jubilantly praised their monarch for not allowing Saruthal to simply expire, but instead, annihilating him with a brutal, skull-crushing blow. They admired how ruthless, savage, and infernal the move was, worthy of a true overlord. Another cried out that such a feat could only be pulled off by the Demon King himself, and that lesser beings like them could never imitate such dominance. They chanted Kratos' name in triumph. He blended with the celebration, shouting with pride. Elsewhere, among the lightning-bound, Fikimir came to a realization. With his superior defeated, he now understood that it was time for his own ascension. By now, the entire farmland had been cultivated. The purpose of Lightning Rod number 2 had been fulfilled. With the raid concluded, their principal objective was achieved. The potato shoots had sprouted, and Kratos had successfully eliminated every blight that jeopardized the upcoming yield. With those hurdles overcome, he exclaimed with fervor that it was the moment to sow the tubers. Yet before they could vacate the premises, the crystalline orb situated upon the pedestal stirred. Kratos took notice. A notification appeared, confirming that his objective of vanquishing Saruthal on the Cliff of the Departed for the 20th instance had now been fulfilled. That led him to wonder whether he had simply resumed from the 19th attempt in the game. The system then alerted him of a concealed scenario now being unlocked. A sealed essence confined within the core of Frozen Spirit had been released due to mishandling. The Heart of Ice began to emit vapor. Its structure opened gradually. As Kratos approached, he was met with astonishment. A diminutive azure hatchling emerged. He stood speechless, eyes wide in disbelief. The juvenile dragon noticed him. With excitement it uttered a name, T-Bone. Their gazes locked in stillness. The small WRM pondered if this bizarre entity before him might be his parent. As Kratos extended his hand, the little one shuddered with sensitivity. The dragon remembered hatching from its shell in pitch blackness, overwhelmed with fear, yet now relieved that its father had found him. That sense of comfort quickly faded once it got a good look at Kratos' unfortunate visage. Even though Kratos made an admiring remark about the creature's cuteness, the hatchling quaked in apprehension. As the group began to exit the chamber, the overzealous agricultural enforcers jokingly hollered about cooking the baby drake. This left the creature misty-eyed. Kratos rebuked them, labeling them fools, and reminded them that raising the beast first would yield greater returns. This, of course, led the little one to suspect that its supposed caretaker might actually intend to consume it. Kratos came to a halt when he noticed the awaiting crowd. The demons had gathered to welcome back the farming corps, their expressions sincere with joy. Fluck ran directly into her father's arms. Families reunited in warmth and relief. The baby dragon's cheeks turned rosy as it sensed the shared affection in the air. He glanced up at the figure holding him, realizing that perhaps they weren't so frightening after all. That was until he looked once more at the face of his so-called guardian. His opinion reversed immediately. No, they were absolutely terrifying. As twilight descended, the hatchling trembled in a shadowy corner. He cautiously peeked out, only to catch sight of the demon sovereign's ominous expression again. It made the little dragon assume they were merely biding their time until he matured enough to be eaten. Meanwhile, the overlord himself was absorbed in thought, primarily concerning how to nourish the young drake. He had heard somewhere that juvenile dragons fed on polished minerals, yet there wasn't a single gemstone in sight. Only piles of corroded scrap littered the storage. Zephyros soon arrived to give his report. As anticipated, significant setbacks had arisen during the construction of embankments. To cultivate vegetation properly, earthen ridges were necessary, raised mounds lining the fields. Ideally, such structures required untainted soil, but their terrain was littered with fragments of stone. Despite their efforts, each attempt by the farm guards to dig deeper resulted in the emergence of more debris. The baby dragon misinterpreted the situation, thinking he was already being forced into labor like the others, though in reality, Kratos merely held him. The demon lord reflected that their terrain more closely resembled a coal excavation site than a field. At the current pace, merely removing the stones would take an eternity. Worse yet, relying so heavily on the workforce daily would rapidly deplete the store of chunios intended for incentives. Even the prospect of receiving backup from other high-ranking demons wouldn't solve the dilemma. A sinister expression again crept across Kratos' face. He daydreamed about being the protagonist in a fantasy serial, one with the ability to summon a magical companion. He imagined some sort of burrowing beast like a wombat, capable of clearing the stones effortlessly. The hatchling in his grasp visibly shook once more, unnerved by the increasingly dreadful countenance his parent was making. Kratos observed Fluke as she diligently dug into the terrain. Her expression was firm with resolve. He continued watching her and came to the realization that it was time to stop complaining and instead devise a solution. While he was immersed in his own reflections, a sudden cry pierced the air, razor squall. Kratos turned pale. A colossal whirlwind was barreling toward them, gaining speed rapidly. It slipped his mind completely. He had known that this expansive barren land occasionally produced vents that released slicing gales at random intervals, and getting caught in one would result in being torn to shreds in moments. He shouted for everyone to seek shelter behind the stone formations. They scrambled toward anything that could provide shadow and dropped low to the ground. Kratos also bolted for cover, but even though the slicing wind was still a distance away, the sheer force of the air pressure was staggering. What he had experienced during gameplay didn't even come close. This was a calamity of nature, the greatest peril to cultivation efforts. But amidst the chaos, he spotted Fluke dashing toward the incoming vortex. Kratos' eyes widened. She wasn't fleeing, she was heading to Azerat. Her father took off after her. Irritation surged in Kratos at the reckless girl. Without hesitation, he handed the hatchling to his own father, instructing him to protect the young drake, warning that anyone who pursued him would face consequences. Bale cried out in protest, warning Kratos that the area was too treacherous, that death was likely. Kratos was fully aware of the risk. But he couldn't bear the thought of losing either his vital lightning conductor or an essential laborer. Cultivation wasn't some peaceful, leisurely endeavor involving leisurely fruit picking. Fluke, struggling, attempted to move the pole, but her efforts were fruitless. Azerat shouted for her to abandon the attempt and escape. In Kratos' mind, he likened both agriculture and survival to waging war. He yelled at the child to step aside, then drove his foot into the stake, shattering it. Azerat let out a piercing scream as he toppled, smacking the ground face first. The demon sovereign's cheek was sliced open. Fluke, though lacerated across her body, continued attempting to untie the restraints. Azerat insisted the knot was one of the binding types, so tight not even one of the 4 heavenly generals could release it. He was adamant she wouldn't succeed and told her again to retreat. Fluke gasped in shock as she was abruptly lifted. Kratos had hoisted both her and the stake. The young WRM could sense the sheer exertion of strength. It knew its guardian was no paragon of durability. Blood poured from Kratos' wounds as he let out a roar and sprinted with all the energy he could muster. The tiny drake, understanding the toll on his caretaker's body, gazed in astonishment at how far the Demon King was willing to go for others. The bladed wind storm drew near. Kratos ran, leaking crimson from his injuries as the storm approached with unrelenting speed. Eventually his body gave in. He collapsed, clutching Fluke tightly in his arms. The pole slipped from his grasp as he hit the dirt. The baby dragon flapped toward his guardian. He now perceived him as a benevolent being. The hatchling inched closer, then inhaled deeply and cried out the name T-Bone at the top of his lungs, unleashing a torrent of glacial wind. It clashed directly with the approaching razor storm. Kratos sensed the violent wind current diminish. He concluded the young dragon had utilized its cryogenic breath to disrupt the upward drafts fueling the vortex. Meanwhile, the tiny creature continued its effort. Despite its small frame, the dragon released a remarkably potent blast of frigid air. At that moment, Kratos resigned himself to his fate, understanding that such a feat might be overwhelming for a hatchling. The shredding wind loomed ever nearer. But then salvation arrived. 3 demons raced to their aid. Fluke's father lifted Kratos, Zephyros swept up Fluke, and Baal carried Azurat. Alongside the infant dragon, they fled from the deadly storm, exerting every ounce of speed and strength they possessed. Later on, Kratos was resting on his bed. 2 commanders approached him, both wearing sinister expressions. Hartok remarked that at last the demon overlord had drifted off, and that he would finally sever his head. Sergi concurred and mentioned that once they dealt with the remaining 2 fools, one of them would rise as the new demon monarch. They both pledged to remain partners until that moment. They pushed open the door and stepped into the chamber, immediately advancing toward the bed, ready to unleash their assaults. However, they froze midway, noticing something odd as the demon overlord had his eyes wide open with a chilling stare. They stood frozen, feeling as if they had been anticipated, yet chose to push forward since it might be their only shot. Just then, Bahal and Azurat entered the chamber, questioning what the 2 thought they were attempting. The towering figure warned that the demon overlord was resting peacefully and that they shouldn't interrupt him. He also added about the expression Kratos made while dozing off, creepy enough to deserve the title of demon overlord even in slumber. With that, he stressed that if they dared disturb their master's rest, they would deeply regret it. The one wearing the monocle admitted he understood the muscle-bound brute's point, but questioned whether Azurat was in the same boat, considering siding with a demon overlord obsessed with agriculture. Azurat answered that he wasn't particularly thrilled about it, but owed his life to Kratos, and thus was merely repaying that debt. Hartok then asked if he hadn't realized yet that this entire potato farming scheme was only causing chaos, certain that beyond failing, it would drive them all into famine. So he wished to know if that didn't bother him. Without delay, Azurat responded that things were simply like that, and recalled young Flute toiling so earnestly despite her age. For that reason he stated if they wished to survive, they had to be willing to risk their lives. Even though he preferred risking it in combat as that was simply his nature. The one with the monocle firmly declared they would regret that decision, then exited the room with Sergi. At that instant, the commanders heard a noise from the chamber and saw that the demon overlord had awakened. Kratos, bewildered, called out Azurat's name, and the general questioned whether he might have overheard their entire discussion, though he quickly clarified he wasn't supporting him or anything similar. He insisted that he was merely repaying what he owed or something along those lines. Nonetheless, Kratos, with a menacing glare, demanded to know what on earth the lightning rod was doing walking around. Azurat, puzzled, had no time to react before receiving a bloody strike so intense it was visible from outside the fortress. They left the room, with Bahal carrying the battered Azurat on his back. And the demon overlord stated that they couldn't waste any more time and urged to gather everyone to resume clearing the lands. The general then mentioned that in truth, the stones had already vanished and that Zephyros had taken care of it. He appeared puzzled upon hearing that, until he noticed his subordinate giving orders to the farming squads. Observing this, he moved closer and questioned the patrol about what had been done with all the stones. Zephyros gestured toward a certain direction, stating he was with a particular creature. From a distance, Kratos glanced over and asked if it was T-Bone. The young dragon carried as many stones as possible in his mouth and flew back repeatedly to fetch more. He figured he couldn't shield his father from the slicing wind since he was still too small. But he was determined to eat plenty so he could grow swiftly. While soaring, he realized his father was calling him and immediately changed course toward him. Which made Kratos thrilled to see his child even while wearing a fearsome expression. He contemplated that the slicing winds didn't occur frequently, and that if his baby dragon kept watching the sky and released the icy breath at just the right moment, they might manage to block the hurricane, but he considered there was no alternative, since avoiding this would lead to an even bigger problem. Then Zephyros mentioned that the Chunho supply was running low and asked whether they should prepare more. Kratos answered that it wasn't necessary and pondered that the first challenge of farming was natural disasters, and the second was cost, hurdles they would need to conquer. Meanwhile, inside the fortress, Sergi rested in her chamber until she removed her helmet. She, a stunning blonde, shook out her hair and remarked that the stench of manure still clung to her even after so many days without stepping into the fields. At that instant, Kratos called at her door, saying they needed to discuss something. She found it odd, since the demon overlord had never come to her room before. So she questioned what he wanted, claiming they had nothing to discuss. He stated he truly needed her assistance and asked her to please open the door. She became enraged and ordered him to leave, but he insisted, warning her that he would enter. Sergi spun around, shouting that there was no reason for them to talk, until she saw Kratos nearly naked crossing the doorway and became frantic at the sight. She then demanded to know if he was insane for entering a woman's room like that. Immediately, he dropped to a crouch, prompting her to ask what on earth he was doing. Kratos explained that without her, he was helpless. She didn't understand and blushed furiously. Kratos reflected that in order to cut costs, he was even prepared to kneel since he urgently needed her sharp blade at that moment. Sergi, still flustered, said that if he needed it so desperately, she was willing to hear him out. He quickly noticed her reaction and couldn't believe she had suddenly changed her demeanor. They proceeded to the storage area and stood before the potatoes. Kratos requested her to slice the potatoes since they needed to be halved for planting. Upon hearing this, she flew into a rage, feeling completely deceived, while cursing the demon overlord with every possible insult. He attempted to clarify that the task was simple, and that she shouldn't cut potatoes with 3 or fewer sprouts, but if there were 4, then she could proceed. He stressed that she must keep in mind the number of sprouts on each side of the slice, since they needed to be evenly divided. After sharing the instructions, he held the potatoes and declared he would toss them. But Sergi firmly stated she never agreed to do that. Nevertheless, he threw them anyway and without time to react. She braced herself and, using remarkable skill, sliced all the potatoes perfectly in half, cutting with extreme accuracy that even left Kratos astonished. He began inspecting them one by one and questioned how she managed to slice so precisely. Turning toward her, he praised her once more, saying he had always known she was the only one capable of it. She thought about that half-hearted flattery and became wary, knowing she wouldn't fall for his sweet talk again, calling him a deceitful trickster. Instantly, he stood up with an intimidating aura and stepped closer to her. Then he grabbed a cloth and wiped his blade until it gleamed. The general felt flustered and asked what he was doing. He answered that potato juice had splashed on it and it needed to be cleaned. She, burning with embarrassment, wondered if he had lost his mind, unable to comprehend why he was acting this way. Besides that look in his eyes, sincere, warm, and intense. Kratos noticed the sword was now spotless and admitted that it felt satisfying, imagining that if the blade wasn't thoroughly cleaned, infections could spread to the potatoes. So it had to be washed meticulously. He approached her again and with a captivating gaze, asked her to please lend a hand, insisting she was the only one who could accomplish it. Inside, he thought she was the sole demon capable of cutting potatoes while also helping to store the chunos. Sergi, still blushing, took a deep breath and agreed to assist this time. Inwardly, she called the demon lord foolish. He rejoiced at her response and said he would fetch hot water and towels so they could spend the entire night cutting together. She simply couldn't understand why the demon lord was so thrilled, once again calling him silly. After that, they continued slicing all the potatoes, while Hartok watched from afar, seeing the two working in total harmony as they cut. He fumed at the sight, thinking Sergi had also become one of the pitiful fools, volunteering to serve the demon lord simply because she received a few compliments. Meanwhile, beneath the scorching sun, Azurat was still tied to the cross, contemplating what it meant to truly live and wondering what purpose a lightning rod had to keep existing since such a harsh life seemed worthless. Then Flute approached and mentioned that the elders had saved Chunos for him, and asked if he wanted to play the game of tossing them. He called her a brat and asked if she truly believed that a great general like him would ever play a game with a low-ranking demon, warning that he would devour her alive if she dared come closer. Regardless, she tosses the food, but it lands directly in his mouth. This infuriates him so much that he demands to know if she doesn't understand how to throw correctly, ordering her to do it properly. From a distance, the one with the monocle observes and concludes that Azurat has already lost his sanity, thinking he has taken so many blows that he can't think clearly anymore. Then he spins around after hearing someone yelling. It was Kratos announcing that they would finally begin planting the potatoes in the fields. Hartok watches the scene and decides that he never expected anything from him anyway. At that exact moment, the farming squad begins expressing gratitude to Sergi for slicing all the potatoes for them. She, slightly embarrassed, responds that she didn't cut them for their sake. The monocle wearer notices her reaction and questions what kind of expression that is, since it doesn't resemble the face of a great demon general. He also notices the lower-ranking demons weeping over the potato seeds, and questions whether they aren't ashamed of themselves. He concludes they are all fools and internally declares that the greatest mind among the demons will rise to take the demon lord's throne. Meanwhile, Kratos instructs them to keep planting since soon the sprouts will emerge and break through the ground. He further warns that when that happens they should start removing the extra sprouts. Bahal claims he's very skilled at cutting, but the demon lord orders him to stay quiet, and explains that each seed piece can produce 3 to 6 sprouts. Following this explanation, he poses the question of what is preferable, more or fewer sprouts. The demons answer that more would be better, but Kratos corrects them, stating that fewer is actually ideal. They appear bewildered and question why fewer is better, convinced the demon lord must be mistaken. Hartok, witnessing the conversation, becomes frustrated and calls everyone utter fools. Then he urges them to think for a moment because if there are too many sprouts, they will compete with each other for nutrients. In other words, the potato itself will end up with fewer nutrients. Kratos overhears from afar and admits his surprise, asking how Hartok knows that, and whether he has cultivated before. Hartok replies by questioning if they truly need to be taught something so fundamental, explaining that the sprouts and the potato share the same nutrients, which should be obvious. Kratos then asks how many sprouts would be ideal, and Hartok responds that 2 would be the obvious answer. But after thinking further, he concludes that practically speaking, they could assume 1 sprout is best. However, if that single sprout damages the potato's root, it might die. He also proposes that they could create fertile soil artificially, by adding manure and turning the earth to improve airflow. Everyone stands in awe at his explanation as he continues, stating that the soil group won't only benefit the potatoes but also weeds that compete for nutrients, which means those weeds will need to be eliminated. The demon lord simply cannot comprehend what he has just heard, and loudly demands that everyone applaud since they have a true genius in their ranks. All the demons begin shouting, "Genius, genius, genius," and Hartok becomes agitated hearing it as they don't stop praising him for even a moment. For a brief instant, he recalls how his mother always called him foolish, and turns around, overcome with emotion, trying to hide that he is tearing up, not fully understanding why he feels that way. Then Kratos steps forward and calls him wise, declaring that from now on, he will appoint him to lead the farmer troops as their commander. Hartok internally thinks this is absurd since his intellect exists to conquer and annihilate other species. However, Kratos yells, asking what everyone is standing around for, insisting they show respect to the supreme elite of the demon kind. All at once, they begin shouting that the general is the elite among elites, and Hartok, seething inside, considers everyone beneath him, but with authority, he orders them to follow him from this moment onward, imagining he will command only briefly since those in front of him continue celebrating endlessly about the new leadership. At that point, a system notification appears stating that Kratos has won the psychological battle. He feels confused by this since he has no idea what it refers to. Another notice informs him that he recognized Bahal's neglected childhood, and transformed him into a loyal subordinate. He questions internally if he really did this unconsciously. There's also a notification mentioning that Azurat, who had never had a friend, has gained a new companion and thus lessened his violent nature. Kratos doesn't quite understand which friend it's referring to. Meanwhile, Sergi's heart softened. She was a woman who had never experienced love. He also established trust in Hartok, who merely desired acknowledgement. Because of these developments, he now has access to a new skill by using 200 happiness points, and the skill revealed is blood vision. He feels shocked because this ability wasn't in the game at all, and is probably original, just like the farmer's throne skill. The system explains that this ability allows him to glimpse the near future of his target, currently up to 6 hours ahead. It also specifies that the target can be a living being or an object, but his surprise intensifies immediately after. A new notification says it can even be used on the sky. This revelation excites him immensely since it's essentially a weather forecast. Meanwhile, somewhere between the forsaken lands of the demons and the human territories, specifically in the village of exiles, a man arrives announcing that he has completely recovered. His subordinate greets him warmly, expressing relief to see him well again. Rivage thanks him for all the support and admits he wishes he could be reborn with a sturdier body next time. Diol chuckles and responds that he'd rather be rich like a noble so he could boss people around. Rivage laughs at that and turns to Kim Chi, telling him they plan to return to the kingdom and asks if he wants to join them. With a serious look, Kimchi replies that he's unsure. Since, as he mentioned before, he doesn't remember his true identity and hasn't lived among humans. Because when he first arrived in that village, the inhabitants didn't exactly welcome him warmly. For that reason he wonders if someone like him would truly be accepted anywhere. The two observe quietly for a moment until Rivage proposes that perhaps he should start by wearing different attire. However, this doesn't happen when Diol teasingly asks if the hero really doesn't want to take off those strange clothes. The messenger concludes that Kimchi must truly be fond of them. Yet, in his mind, the hero admits that he actually wants to change clothes. But he cannot figure out why they simply won't come off, as if they are fused to his body. Rivage thanks one of the villagers for their hospitality and remarks that living there solely because one is a descendant of an exile is extremely harsh. He adds that when he returns to the kingdom, he will inform the king about this situation. Kimchi watches this exchange and imagines that Rivage is a nobleman sent to explore the territories near the demons under royal orders. And he is indeed not an arrogant person but rather kind and worthy of respect. This reflection makes him ponder who he himself used to be and concludes that all he remembers is following orders and eliminating others repeatedly. Thinking about this causes him to lower his head, as he wonders if he is even capable of doing anything besides taking lives. Back in the demon realm, the farming squad starts to notice the sprouts emerging and cheers excitedly since they are finally appearing. The generals approach to witness it too, realizing that the plants are truly growing. Flute rushes over to Azurat to share the exciting news. He erupts in anger upon hearing it and demands to know what he's supposed to do with that information. Then, the Kratos calls for the agricultural division and announces that the next phase will be burying, asking the wise Hartok to elaborate further. Hartok explains that burying means covering the sprout stems with earth to prevent the young potatoes from being exposed to sunlight, because if that happens they will change color, lose flavor, and even become toxic, thus becoming what are called spoiled potatoes. Kratos requests applause since the explanation was so insightful, which leaves the general slightly embarrassed. He then gazes upward to examine the weather that day and reflects that he ended up spending 200 happiness points on the weather prediction ability, and his blood vision skill has already evolved, with the activation condition requiring him to stare for 200 seconds without blinking. However, he starts making an expression like a stray dog since his eyes begin burning and it becomes exhausting. The lower-ranking demons witness this and believe that the Demon King is shedding tears of joy because the sprouts have grown. After some time, the ability finally activates, revealing that for the next 6 hours, the weather is expected to stay mostly clear and dry, suggesting that it might be wise to put away the humidifier. Kratos finds this intriguing and tells T-Bone that he will be able to rest peacefully since there won't be that ridiculous windstorm. At that moment, Zephyrus approaches and mentions he has an urgent report to deliver, explaining that the subordinate of the second Star Master has returned. They then head back to the castle and soon after LaFleur introduces himself, stating he received the message about pausing agricultural activities and reports that the third Star Master, Ruster, launched an assault on them, claiming that the Demon Lord had grown weak and that he should seize his position. The Kratos becomes irritated because he thinks all demons behave the same. Zephyrus remarks that this truly poses a problem because if the third Star Master defeats the second Star Master and they ally, it will not be easy to handle them. Kratos agrees and points out that although they are low in level, their numbers are overwhelmingly large. He contemplates that he must find a solution before the second Star Master collapses, even though he cannot neglect the agricultural tasks for too long. The region attacked by the third Star Master is a deep underground abyss known as the Swamp of Decay, which, when compared to the game map, is actually 10 times larger and absurdly distant. He heads to the opposite abandoned area, which should provide bonuses in the game and is located inside the Demon Lord's castle, but it isn't functioning. This makes him ponder how to resolve this and manage the farming at the same time. He pauses to think, not fully understanding why he is so concerned, and with a wicked grin, decides that since he is the Demon King, the boss doesn't have to do everything himself. So he sticks to his plan and Sergi makes a fuss, claiming she isn't fighting because of him. Bahal proudly announces he will follow orders no matter what. The Kratos concludes that he can dispatch 2 of his 4 generals to the battlefield, and along with some powerful demons, they can make a significant impact. He knows that in the boss's domain, the shortcut system is fully connected, including one that leads directly to the Swamp of Decay. Aware of this, he orders the long-range sprayer to be launched, believing that if he and Hartok fully concentrate on the fights, everything will succeed. The Second Kingdom is engulfed in flames and Planus, the second Star Master, is kneeling on the ground and confronts the enemy, demanding how he dares challenge the Demon King and commit treason. The demon approaches and declares that this is a revolt, saying he had no other choice. This is Ruster, the third Star Master. He claims that ending that war will only bring devastation to their race. Planus becomes even more infuriated and argues that the Demon King promised to provide fertile lands, so they no longer need to battle humans for sustenance. Ruster responds that this is not the issue, and with his weapon lifted, he states that fighting with bravery is the pride of their kind. Suddenly, a weapon flies toward them and strikes the Star Master's club directly, knocking it away. He turns to see what caused it and realizes it is two of the celestial generals. Sergi wastes no time and admits to Ruster that he is correct, as their race truly was born to battle. She says they adore fighting more than anything else but wonders how things ended up like this and why they even started enjoying it in the first place, but she finally understands after observing everything that happened lately. Flute runs with a bright smile on her face. She bursts through her house door, shouting and calling her father to hurry to the fields. Once they return to the field, they are amazed to see the beautiful crops that have grown. Witnessing this brings tears to the lower demons and even Azurat, who also weeps because of it. Hartok and Zephyros watch from afar, as does Kratos, standing proudly before his grand accomplishment. The little girl runs, calling for the Demon King, and Happy says that it is truly beautiful and that she has never seen anything like it before. Kratos simply remains quiet. Back with Sergi, she charges fiercely at the demonic master and attacks with her countless swords. The opponent, distracted, fails to notice the tyrant closing in and gets grabbed. She seizes the chance and unleashes an endless barrage of strikes while her target is restrained. Ruster starts begging her to stop and insists he never mentioned finishing anyone off, claiming he was there to save lives and doesn't understand what they are doing. She reflects that this might be true, but she doesn't stop attacking, declaring that sometimes one must be eliminated to protect many others. He becomes enraged hearing this since it makes no sense to him. Meanwhile, Kratos, in front of Flute, remarks that finally they started to sprout and that there were many at once, then orders the useless flowers to be cut immediately. The demons are upset about this, and Azurat starts yelling, declaring he will never forgive the Demon King for being so heartless. Hartok enjoys hearing this since even in that situation, the king stayed true to his nature. Because of that, he asks what everyone is waiting for since they must carry out the order at once. Dirok, though upset, kneels in front of the flower and sees it looking sad. Another demon laments, saying he cannot do it because they put in so much effort to make them grow and had never seen anything so beautiful on that land. The general, with little patience, warns that if they leave the flowers there, they will consume all the nutrients instead of the potatoes doing so, and the priority is to make the potatoes grow large and well-fed, not create a flower bed. The farming troops then comply even though it pains them deeply. Kratos watches this with excitement since he enjoyed hearing the word potato echo in his mind. After that, the generals return and report that they have captured Ruster. The Demon King makes it clear that this is the consequence for sparking a rebellion and that everything he built was destroyed by another, and he will do something about it. The Star Master simply asks to finish him already since a demon who lost his honor in combat deserves nothing but death. Without delay, Kratos uses his ability to fry the demonic master, but he laughs as he didn't even feel a tickle because he wears excellent armor. Kratos questions if that really happened and if he didn't take any damage at all. Then he drags him to the plantation and uses a lightning rod, explaining that he actually found the task quite useful. Then he uses his ability again, making Ruster scream in agony and also beg to be finished already, and since now they have a new lightning rod. The Demon King requests someone to take Azurat off the cross since he isn't recovering well and it's long overdue to retire him. They untie him and Flute runs toward him to help, but stops midway because his expression was terrifying. The general keeps muttering that the little demon girl humiliated him for too long and that's why he wants to devour her first. She freezes in shock upon seeing his ominous aura. However, his legs give out and he collapses face first to the ground. He curses it all since it has been ages since he last walked until Bahal approaches and lifts him into his arms, leaving Azurat inconsolable to the point of demanding what the hell he thinks he's doing since he's not a princess to be carried around like that. The big guy ties him to his back to carry him and says it was an order from the Demon Lord and that he'll stay like that for now. The Prince of Darkness is furious about it, swearing that he will never forget this humiliation. Meanwhile, Kratos watching from a distance admits that he was worried that Lunatic would snap again, but when he used his blood vision skill, he quickly knew the weather would stay the same for 6 hours and so he decided to release him. He points his finger and says that harvest day will come soon so they need to move faster. But deep down he's relaxed since he has a super fast weed cutter that can eliminate the flowers instantly. He also has a professional transporter that makes everything much smoother. He reflects that, in a way, the autumn harvest isn't far off and the food supplies are steadily depleting, and even though demons are used to famine, he can't bear to see how exhausted they'll become. At that moment, someone approaches calling out to him. It was Planus, who introduces himself as the master of the second star and is there to express his gratitude for having been saved. Kratos stands quiet for a moment, and so does the star master. Then, he abruptly shifts his expression to rage, leaving Planus bewildered as to why he suddenly turned furious. All Kratos can think about is why that demon showed up empty-handed to offer thanks when he could have at least brought some wine or a few fruits. The Star Master mentions that he is currently gathering some of the third star's subordinates and will soon put them to work. All the Demon King can think about is that the potatoes are thriving splendidly, and he wants to harvest them quickly to prepare chunos. He says that what he really wants is to watch the demons eat until they are completely satisfied. Only then does he pause to think about why he started doing this in the first place. While lost in his thoughts, the second Star Master announces that he will prepare the troops and then leaves the field. Kratos watches him depart and considers that this Star Master was among the weakest and least advanced, yet he liked the confidence he carried and his unwavering loyalty to the demon homeland. He also guesses that this demon is technically like a plant, so in the end he might turn out quite valuable. As Planus walks through the field, he feels under his feet that the earth is incredibly rich and brimming with nutrients unlike anything he had ever sensed before. After strolling for a while, he imagines that at first he was merely a sprout and therefore never grew properly using nutrients. But he finds that soil remarkably different because it was nurtured by Lord Kratos. He uses his power and begins to root himself into the mountain, concluding that he can become stronger in that ground to the extent of potentially rising to the level of Demon King. Thinking about this, his roots start spreading throughout the entire land. The next day, Kratos shouts at the low demons to prepare for exercise time. Starting with arm movements, the Demon Lord guides them with bizarre music. The low demons sing along with him, copying every single demonstration. Kratos, watching T-Bone enjoying the exercises, thinks about how messy the crew was at the beginning and feels amazed by how precise they are now. Thanks to their demonic physical properties, they can follow even the most surprising instructions. While they roll from side to side, Kratos realizes that the low demons will become essentially strong under his command. Suddenly, Bahal arrives, shouting loudly while carrying Azurat on his back. He announced that all the potato leaves had turned yellow, immediately catching Kratos' attention. Everyone hurried to the field and quickly noticed the obvious change in the color of the potato foliage. Zephyros sighed heavily at the sight and questioned aloud if it would truly be impossible to produce anything now. Sergi grew visibly disheartened witnessing the scene. Hartok, on the other hand, found himself completely puzzled, unable to comprehend what had gone wrong. He speculated whether it might have been due to the absence of wind or perhaps even a shortage of water. This left him feeling frustrated and betrayed by his own expectations, causing him to angrily question why on earth he had pinned his hopes on something that now seemed nothing more than a foolish delusion. Just then, the brother stepped forward, approaching the generals and making his way over to the potatoes. He knelt down, grabbed one sprout and carefully pulled out a potato. This action startled the monocled general, who immediately noticed that while the potatoes appeared slightly pale, they were still impressively large, even 2 or 3 times the size of the first potato they had planted. Kratos broke into a satisfied grin and pointed out that they were overlooking the real success. The potatoes had effectively done their job. By absorbing all the nutrients from the leaves, they had grown larger and, as a result, likely tastier. He declared proudly that everyone had performed exceptionally well and emphasized that this achievement had only been possible thanks to their collective effort. Hearing this, all the generals became deeply moved, realizing that their hard work had not been in vain after all. Later that night, back at the castle, Kratos lay in bed reflecting on the praise he had given to the demons earlier. This moment of appreciation stirred up memories from his past life, when he had once planted a tomato plant and his grandmother had complimented him, saying the tomatoes were thriving because of his care. The next memory that haunted him was seeing her being taken into an ambulance, and all he could do was scream helplessly as he watched her being intubated. After dwelling on these thoughts for a while, he rolled over and began to criticize himself, thinking that such sentimental feelings were pointless. As the Demon King, someone meant to embody coldness and authority, he believed he shouldn't allow himself to feel emotions like that. He also reminded himself that even though they would soon have hundreds of potatoes to eat, they could not afford to let their guard down. Relying too heavily on potatoes could lead them straight into starvation if something happened like a pest infestation, similar to the infamous Irish famine. In other words, he understood clearly that while potatoes would solve the immediate crisis, they would eventually need to plant a variety of other seeds to ensure future survival. Suddenly, a violent tremor shook the ground, prompting him to leap up and demand to know what was happening and if there was any issue within the castle. At that exact moment, a massive crack split open, and a gigantic root erupted from below, smashing everything in its path and shooting up to a towering height before him. Kratos stood there, stunned and horrified, shouting in disbelief, questioning what on earth that monstrous thing was. Meanwhile, outside in the fields, Flute was still carefully examining the potato leaves. She recalled that the Demon King had mentioned that the leaves would naturally fall off as the potatoes matured. However, she sensed something felt terribly off and began to dig with determination, convinced that something was wrong beneath the surface. When she finally pulled one of the potatoes out, she was horrified to discover that the vegetable had simply vanished. She prepares to dash off, intending to alert the adults immediately, but soon freezes in place as the entire castle becomes engulfed by countless enormous branches. Kratos finds himself ensnared by the massive tendrils, and just then the Star Master emerges, laughing mockingly and remarking that the Demon King now resembles a helpless insect. Kratos cannot comprehend what he's seeing since that towering figure is actually Planus, the very one who had assisted them only moments earlier. Planus reveals, boasting proudly, that thanks to the nutrient-rich, fertile earth Kratos had cultivated, he was able to grow into this monstrous form. It is only then that Kratos pieces everything together and realizes in horror what must have happened to his precious crops, his rage boiling over as he roars, calling Planus a bastard and demanding to know exactly what he had done to the fields. The Star Master taunts him, asking sarcastically if he's furious and what exactly he plans to do about it. Without warning, Planus violently swings Kratos back and forth before hurling him forcefully to the ground, causing severe injuries instantly. Meanwhile, the generals scramble frantically around the castle, struggling to make sense of the chaos, while Bahal pleads to be freed so he can rush to rescue the Demon King. Sergi and Azurat question if he's lost his mind, pointing out that even if they attempted something, facing that star demon would be impossible. Yet, Bahal remains defiant, asserting that indeed the Demon Lord is weak, a truth he discovered when he himself was aided by Kratos, proving how fragile the king truly is. The devastation within the castle continues without pause, until Planus, having absorbed all the nutrients from the earth, assumes a gargantuan form. At that moment, Kratos plummets helplessly from the immense height. The generals gaze upward in disbelief, and Zephyros is left aghast, questioning if that towering creature is truly Planus. Planus commands all to listen and with a chilling voice, declares that Kratos is dead. All the generals are left in utter shock, unable to process it, and the loyal servants and the baby dragon share the same disbelief. The lower demons are overcome with grief, especially Flute, who breaks down sobbing uncontrollably. Planus continues his proclamation, reminding them of the ancient demon law that dictates power belongs solely to the strongest. For that reason, he officially declares himself the new Demon King and orders every last one of them to bow before his overwhelming might. Hartok reflects on the unfolding scene, realizing that the Star Master had indeed absorbed all the land's nutrients, and with Kratos incapacitated, he is now unquestionably the strongest. Accepting this brutal truth, he bows, resigning himself to the rule that demons always follow strength above all else. Sergi, filled with frustration, reluctantly bows as well, followed by Bahal and Azurat. Zephyros remains in disbelief, paralyzed by the reality of the situation, while Azurat urges him impatiently, demanding that he show proper respect. Seeing no alternative, finally bows too, and in that moment, everyone submits to the colossal new king, while Zephyros can only cry, mourning the loss of his sovereign. Meanwhile, Kratos finds himself in a different realm, where he hears the voice of his mother from his childhood, calling to him and inviting him to play hide and seek. He senses something odd about that day and wonders aloud if this might be a dream. His mother instructs him to close his eyes tightly, promising to count to 10, and only after that should he begin searching for her. The young boy begins to count, and when he finally reaches 10, he calls out, asking desperately where she is, unable to locate her. In a rising panic, he starts to scream, pleading for his mother to come out, and wonders if counting to 10 again might somehow bring her back. Kratos observed that moment with his head lowered, as his childhood self could do nothing but cry out for his mother, sobbing and insisting that he had finished counting and for that reason, wanted her to appear. Suddenly, a system notification called out to Kratos, urging him to wake up. He eventually forced his eyes open, trying to comprehend what had happened and questioning whether the message had truly addressed him by name. Confused, he asked the notification where it was and if, by any chance, he had already died. The system instructed him to move, warning that if he did so, he might still survive. He wondered if he could use the glitch technique but quickly realized he couldn't, since there wasn't even enough space to shift his body. However, he noticed that at least one of his hands could still move, so he decided that even if it had to be slow, he would begin digging. Despite the agony, he kept pushing himself, determined not to give up. Meanwhile, outside, Planus called for the scribe to come forward. Zephyros approached and introduced himself formally as the recording secretary. The Star Master then commanded him to record everything accurately, declaring that this was their first grand step and announcing that they would soon begin the invasion of human territories, making it clear that they intended to dominate all humans and raise them like livestock to be consumed. Hartok lamented the situation, remarking that it seemed they had gone back to the beginning. Azurat thought it was actually good news, as at least he would get to fight and slaughter as many as he pleased. Sergi reflected that this was the life demons had always led anyway, and if it meant satisfying his hunger, then so be it. Bahal, on the other hand, didn't think about anything at all. At the same time, all the generals struggled to understand why this new situation left them feeling so uneasy. Meanwhile, Kratos kept trying to crawl out from beneath the debris but felt his breath slipping away as he struggled to breathe properly. Back outside, Planus ordered all the demons to seize their weapons, declaring that it was time to march forward. Zephyros had a thought and warned the new demon king that they couldn't go to war at that moment. Planus didn't appreciate hearing that, and his menacing look caused all the generals to tense up in fear. The secretary tried to clarify that the only food they currently had was a small supply of potatoes, which wouldn't even be enough to feed half the army. Planus dismissed the concern, saying they actually had more than enough food. Then, using his massive branches, he seized Flute, leaving her terrified. Her father began screaming desperately in horror. This immediately caught Azurat's attention. Planus displayed the frightened girl and announced that there were many weak, worthless demons there, ordering that they be used as sustenance. The girl screamed frantically, insisting that it wasn't like that anymore, and that nowadays they could survive without devouring each other. She shrieked louder and louder, reminding everyone that the king had promised them such a future. Planus watched her desperate cries and then dropped her from the towering height. Meanwhile, Kratos, still trapped under the rubble, realized that his heart was stopping. He concluded that if he died now, all the demons would starve. So, he forced his eyes open and activated the bloody strike technique on himself, electrocuting his own body. He decides he cannot allow everyone to starve again, so he resumes digging, screaming with all his might to draw out energy, and with that effort he manages to dig even if only little by little. Outside, Planus is watching as Azurat rescues the little girl, cradling her in his arms. The MC keeps struggling to climb, and whenever his heart threatens to stop, he uses his bloody impact technique to jolt himself awake, but he realizes he's far too exhausted. Then he starts to contemplate whether he still has a long way to go, or if at least he is heading in the right direction, questioning whether his efforts still hold any meaning. Thinking about this weighs him down even more. Outside, all the generals stare wide-eyed, watching Azurat holding the child. Flute is speechless after being saved, and the Star Master asks if he has completely lost his mind. The Blood Prince just keeps staring until he feels the tremor and realizes the massive demon is closing in. Panicked, he tries to cover up by claiming that the little girl is his snack since he had been eyeing her for a long time. However, Planus doesn't buy into this absurd excuse and strikes Azurat harshly with a branch, sending him flying past the generals and leaving him knocked out on the ground. Zephyros laments the scene since he's powerless to intervene. The Star Master once again demands that everyone get ready for battle. Zephyros musters courage and shouts that there's no valid reason to proceed like this. Immediately after saying that, one of the branches lunges at him, but the tyrant general moves swiftly with his axe and intercepts the strike, making Planus even more enraged. Bahal yells that the Demon King had left a mission for the secretary, questioning who will count the potatoes if he perishes. The Star Master retorts, asking if they are suggesting a rebellion. Hartok quickly denies it, saying such a thing would be unthinkable, but he stresses that they believe the former Demon King Kratos's plan to invest in farming was a much wiser directive. Sergi requests permission to speak and recalls that the previous Demon King showed them a path where no one needed to die, and because of that, she questions why they should go to war if another solution already exists. Planus loses patience at being defied and begins summoning countless roots while screaming that he is the strongest and, therefore, everyone must submit to him. However, they refuse, declaring that true strength comes from what is just, and all the generals ready themselves for combat. The lower demons also shout that the Real King is only Kratos, warning Planus that he will pay for what he did to the fields. Instantly, the roots move toward the demons, but Hartok doesn't allow it, using his mist barrier to block the attacks and protect the farming troop. Bahal places Sergi on his hand and hurls her into the air, giving her the opportunity to slice through all the incoming branches. She then looks directly at the Star Master and yells that she will start by tearing out his eye first. However, he finds this amusing and, besides blocking her attack, also captures the generals with shocking ease. Then he announces that they are all going straight to the canopy for daring to oppose the new Demon King and makes it clear that he is 1,000 times more majestic than the feeble Kratos. While attacking the entire troop, he declares that the former king was nothing but a weakling who perished without even resisting, and because of that, he questions what was so special about that fool since he saw nothing admirable in him. He gets ready to deliver the final strike on Zephyros, who is trying to protect Flute, until suddenly he hears a voice from the MC asking why he's hurting his self-esteem like that. Then Kratos appears, fist clenched, intercepting the attack aimed at his secretary. Next, he smashes the branch into dust in an instant. Planus is stunned to see him alive, unlike Flute, who immediately smiles upon seeing him. The system message appears, stating that Kratos has unlocked a new system and skill at the edge of death, and that concentrated nutrition has been activated. Zephyros and Flute stood frozen, wide-eyed, as Kratos emerged with sudden violence, his crushing blow stunning them both. His bruised and blood-stained knuckles tore deep into the terrain, a brutal signal of his relentless battle to claw his way back. His gaze radiated an intense crimson blaze, forged from the strength of his former self. To grasp this overwhelming energy, one must look back to a time when Kratos was younger, untamed and broken. A frail elder had once asked why he kept speaking as if surrender was his only path. A despondent, youthful Kratos, hunched low and consumed by despair, confessed that existence had become unbearable. Calm but firm, the woman pressed on, questioning if life truly was that unbearable, then why bother surviving at all? Holding a tiny seed gently between her palms, she told him that each of us is a seed. She insisted that all life begins as a seed, forced to fight upward through difficulty to reach the light. With optimism and patience, she claimed one sprouting life would inspire others, and that inspiration would spread. In her serene certainty, she imagined a world reshaped by growth, starting from a single act of resilience. She had promised that all would turn green, conjuring an image of rebirth and flourishing beauty. Kratos, young and raw, rejected what he saw as hollow sentiment, drowning in the weight of his own suffering. Furious, he screamed, questioning why he had been forsaken by his parents, wondering aloud if he was nothing but a failed seed. Tears fell as he vowed he would survive, on his own terms without anyone's help. In a flash of dread, that bold promise shattered as he raced into a hospital room, reality crashing down. With breath caught in his throat, he watched the dying elder, her words echoing like fate's final whisper. She had said that they were all destined seeds, haunting, gentle and profound words. It was in that moment, as her life faded, that Kratos's true path and inner power began to awaken. Now, with a fierce resurgence in the present, a glowing system prompt appeared, triggered by the immense force of Kratos's awakening blow. Brilliant golden energy radiated outward, signaling the unleashing of his unrestrained power. Kratos took notice. A system called Mana Seed had activated, something unknown, clearly not from the game's usual framework. It presented a third-tier Mana Seed, enhancing his attributes and unlocking a sliver of hope for escape. Then came the unveiling of a rare function, concentrated nutrition, an ability allowing all stats to be funneled into a single category, usable once each day. Kratos's eyes lit up, burning with determination. His course was now clear. A baseline boost of 30% to all attributes appeared as the seed took root. A radiant blue nucleus, shaped like a seed, materialized before him, the heart of this new strength. His power now amplified further to 39%, the metamorphosis drawing near. Letting loose a primal roar, Kratos invoked concentrated nutrition, directing the totality of his stats into raw physical might. His physical prowess skyrocketed to an incredible 155%, all other stats falling to mere fragments. With explosive force, he erupted from below the surface, his body wrapped in dirt, a walking embodiment of brute strength. Planus recoiled, visibly staggered by the crushing weight behind Kratos's punch. The towering foe stumbled, disoriented by the sudden reversal of momentum. The earth itself groaned and cracked beneath Kratos's return, unable to withstand the magnitude of his reawakening. From the rubble, a golden-lit arm thrust upward, declaring the return of a forgotten legend. His flowing cape swept the air dramatically, a banner of war revived. Kratos, once demon lord, now reborn, stood unyielding, staring down the immense form of Planus. Still trembling from the impact, Planus demanded answers, voice shaken, asking how Kratos had managed to survive, if it's really him standing tall. Kratos, wounded but intact, responds sarcastically by asking if seeing him isn't clear enough to know that he is in fact himself. Nearby, the demon farmers gazed on with faces lit by both relief and awe, recognizing their true sovereign at last. Kratos now stood before them, restored and resolute, the leader they had long awaited as the farmers erupted into cheers for a harvest yet to come. T-Bone, seeing his father, rushed toward Kratos without hesitation. Seeking solace, the little creature pressed affectionately against Kratos' cheek, drawn by warmth and familiarity. Hartok, though visibly relieved by Kratos' return, concealed a storm of lingering doubts beneath his expression. Sergei, clad in battered armor and stained with defeat, trembled at the thought that Planus might be insurmountable. Even Bahal, wounded yet breathing, questioned whether even a demon lord's strength could match Planus' monstrous force. Planus, however, perceived Kratos' reappearance not as a threat, but as an ideal opportunity to extinguish all resistance. Its glowing eyes radiated murderous intent as it promised the annihilation of Kratos and anyone who dared follow him. Yet Kratos, cradling the young dragon, answered the beast's declaration with a calm, unwavering grin. He would not back down. He spoke with clarity, explaining that despite Planus' sheer magnitude, its movements followed a set rhythm, like a predictable raid boss. Internally, Kratos assured himself, every one of the creature's attacks could be sidestepped. He had seen all of these patterns before. Tactical and methodical. He knew the farmer battalion, who had endured brutal training sessions under his command, were equally prepared. Their bodies had been conditioned to react, trained to dodge even monstrous blows without hesitation. As Planus thundered forward, unleashing a deafening battle cry, Kratos issued the call for formation. His troops assembled without delay. The titanic foot of the enemy came crashing down, aiming to crush them in one strike. Kratos ordered them to shift left, and the squad moved with perfect unity. The ground split violently beneath the place they just stood, but their synchronized movement spared them. He called for them to veer right, and again they executed the maneuver like clockwork. He barked for them to hit the ground as a sweeping limb cut through the air just overhead. Kratos' voice rang out, commanding them to roll and not stop moving as the team ducked and spun through the chaos. He commanded them to fall back, leading a coordinated retreat as Planus' pounding blows tore craters into the battlefield. Explosive and relentless, Planus' might was staggering, but Kratos' core adapted with every strike. He shouted again for them to leap, as an enormous limb shattered the terrain where they'd been moments earlier. The beast howled in exasperation, unable to grasp why none of its punishing blows landed. Kratos' grin widened. He had seen it clearly, Planus' patterns left it exposed during the recovery after each assault. He directed them to rotate formation, preparing his unit to capitalize on that fleeting moment of vulnerability. Together, Kratos and his steadfast farmer legion turned as one, primed for the next phase. He raised a hand and pointed, marking the moment to act with pinpoint precision. Fuming, Planus trembled with suppressed fury, its rage mounting as futility dawned on it. A deep red glow enveloped the beast, and with a deafening cry, it descended into full frenzy. Its enormous form writhed and convulsed, overcome by a wave of destructive mania. Unstable and savage, the creature pounded the earth in a blind fit, toppling all within reach. Kratos muttered with a knowing smile that this was it. Planus had entered its berserker phase just as expected. He bellowed for T-Bone to go, releasing the little dragon into battle. Brave and bubbling with resolve, the tiny dragon inhaled deeply, puffing up its chest with purpose. Focused and icy, it released a torrent of freezing breath, a concentrated blast of frigid air. The frost-laced attack struck Planus directly, clinging to its thick hide and beginning to immobilize its form. Caught off guard, Planus recoiled, its body twitching as the unnatural cold seeped through its enormous limbs. Kratos observed thoughtfully, even with his reinforced strength, brute force alone wouldn't be enough to break through such a massive frame. Yet the creature was still a plant. That simple fact anchored Kratos' calculated approach. The thought sparked a glint in his eyes as his mind unfolded its ruthless scientific logic. Bitter cold, merciless and methodical, would expand Planis's internal structure. The extreme temperature would rupture the beast's fibrous body from the inside out. A smirk crept across Kratos's face. He knew the moment of execution was drawing near. T-Bone swiftly retreated just as the massive entity began to groan under the freezing pressure. A sharp, echoing fracture resounded across the battlefield, the sound of Planis's colossal figure starting to splinter. Its eye widened with dreadful realization, now grasping the brutal ingenuity behind Kratos's plan. The once rampaging beast, burdened by its own towering weight and brittle form, had become its own undoing. Kratos's smile grew colder, savoring the impending ruin. Planis howled in panic, asking what was happening as its insides shredded themselves apart. Surrounded by crumbling chaos, Kratos stood motionless, collected, victorious, as T-Bone fluttered back to him. The little dragon nuzzled against his arm, weary yet triumphant. Kratos gently praised him, acknowledging the effort. Cradling his companion, Kratos stepped forward, preparing to deliver the concluding blow. He crouched low, muscles coiling with power as he readied his final offensive. He growled that this would end now, hurling himself forward with blistering velocity toward the faltering Titan. As he closed in, Kratos exposed another botanical vulnerability, one that plagued all tree-like foes. A hollowed, dark knot, the heart of weakness, yawned open across Planis's bark-like chest. That cavity, the very flaw in its otherwise impenetrable surface, marked the end. Summoning the full might of his enhanced power, Kratos reared back his fist. With a primal cry, he drove it into the knot, striking with terrifying force. The impact unleashed a chain reaction. The titanic frame of Planis convulsed and shattered. It broke, splintered, and groaned as its structure buckled from within. Each fragment of its wooden flesh fell like shards of a collapsing tower. Finally, a guttural moan escaped the beast's core, and Planis's massive frame began to cave in, signaling its annihilation. As its form disintegrated further, its essence evaporated into the air, dissolving, scattering. A violent explosion ripped through the landscape as the core burst apart, dispersing corrupted energy in all directions. Onlookers, Kratos's allies, gazed from below in stunned reverence. Their demon lord had triumphed. The final wail of Planis echoed briefly before silence took its place. The great tree's reign ended, or so it seemed. Yet amidst the settling dust and shards, a haunting remnant remained. A piece of its frigid form, suspended in crystalline stillness, pulsed with eerie green light. It refused to dissolve. Refused to fade. Perplexed, Kratos narrowed his gaze, unsure if the monster had truly perished. He watched as the distorted visage of Planis receded, only to sink unsettlingly into the soil. Its root-like appendages slowly disappeared beneath the surface, its presence lingering like a toxin. This wasn't how boss-level enemies were supposed to die. Suddenly, a chilling certainty gripped him. From the tainted ground below, Planis began to reform. Its essence twisted upward, reshaping into something darker, more fearsome. Kratos tried to move, but it was too late. Tangled tendrils of living bark ensnared him. He was bound, immobile. Towering above him stood a newly reborn monstrosity, a twisted, humanoid tree abomination. Across the battlefield, the farmer corps stared in horror, their morale cracking as the nightmare renewed. Planis, now reawakened and grotesque, announced the truth behind its rebirth. It had not fallen, it had fed. Consuming the battlefield's nutrients, it had returned stronger. A cursed seed, that's what it called itself. A cursed seed, nurtured in poisoned earth. And now, bearing the legacy of corrupted might, it declared its new purpose, to drench the world in venomous death. With a menacing promise, the reawakened plant monstrosity lunged forward, intent on annihilating Kratos. Bahal interceded, swinging a massive axe in defiance. Ancient, thudding, his strike landed with a solid crash against the beast's hide. But the blow had no effect. The grotesque creature remained untouched. Before the warrior could react, Planis retaliated with overwhelming force, sending him hurtling through the air like a broken doll. Sergi emerged, retaliating with a storm of razor-edged blades. Her flurry barely grazed the surface before Planis's unyielding form repelled her offensive. A counterstrike followed instantly, leaving Sergi wounded and crumpled beside Bahal. Witnessing his allies falter, Hartok surged forth, releasing a tremendous retaliatory strike. The blow connected, forcing the towering plant to stagger, pained and furious. Eyes burning with resolve, Azurat drew forth a lethal dagger, prepared for a precise, vital blow. His blade pierced Planis, acting with grim determination. Crying out for bountiful harvest, he prepared to finish the battle with a decisive slash. Though comrades had fallen in the clash, he understood the true menace still loomed. He was the last one facing the abomination alone. Besieged, surrounded by silence, with every companion subdued, he prepared himself for the climactic confrontation. And then, with a swift and stunning motion, Hajarat severed the creature's head. Crumbling, eerie, the lifeless head tumbled as an ominous green glow radiated from the decapitated body. The colossus began to break apart, its hulking frame dissolving in slow, glowing disintegration. Sparkling motes scattered as the beast was reduced to dust. At last, every trace of Planus, even its twisted origin, had been obliterated, cleansed completely from the world. A peaceful, radiant shimmer lingered over the battlefield, casting ethereal light upon the victors. The farmer corps and surviving warriors stood still, bathing in the fading glow, their trials ended. Freed from the plant's corruption, the former demon lord spat curses upon Planus's demise. Hartok and comrades, though wounded and wearied, began to recover as the echoes of battle died. Meanwhile, Zephyros pledged to amend the betrayals that had transpired and claimed the victory of the demon lord's army. Hartok proudly proclaimed the triumph of the demon lord's ranks. Kratos watched the cheers, but concern took him. The cheers drowned the moment. The farmer corps roared with joy, hailing the victory and their fearless leader. Kratos stood at the center, basking in the adoration of his steadfast legion. Kratos screamed loud for them to stop, desperation climbing in his tone. His crimson gaze flickered, filled with unwavering intensity. Before him stretched a field of ruined, lifeless bodies, scorched remnants and shattered earth. He stared in silence, absorbing the devastation, the quiet cost of their conquest. Even a single fallen leaf bore witness to the catastrophe. He dropped to his knees, the weight of their loss crashing down. Their crops, their people, they would face famine again. Could he demand more suffering from them? No. He couldn't let that cycle repeat. His closest allies gathered around him, their silent presence echoing his sorrow. Then, sudden and radiant, a glowing sphere emerged above him. Mysterious and pulsing, it hovered precisely over a solitary, lifeless leaf. Slowly the orb descended, merging with the brittle husk. Hopeful, unexpected, a miracle revealed itself. And then the dead leaf shimmered. It pulsed once, vivid, alive, renewed by unseen power. Zephyros observed Kratos, whose drooped posture betrayed a storm of frustration, and an unexpected wave of empathy stirred within him, not only for the present moment but for a memory rooted deep in his past. That recollection carried him to a dank prison cell where frightened demons cowered in silence. Among them, one muttered cynically about the new demon lord, dismissing any significance it might bring. To him, their fate as livestock was unchangeable, mere fodder under any rule. Then came the sound of rusted hinges creaking open. A green-skinned demon stepped inside. Panic surged through the cell like wildfire. Most recoiled into corners, trembling. All except one. Young Zephyros remained seated, his expression void of emotion. The green intruder, puzzled by this apathy, approached. Without hesitation, it seized him by the collar like one might handle poultry. Still, the boy's demeanor remained unchanged. Just as the creature drew its blade, an explosion of motion ended its advance. Kratos had arrived, silent, lethal and filled with fury. In an instant the green demon's skull was pulverized, collapsing like overripe fruit under pressure. In the aftermath, Kratos questioned the boy's lack of fear. Zephyros responded with startling calmness. He confessed that fear had long left him, and perhaps death would be more merciful than an existence spent in dread. Their struggles felt meaningless, just cattle awaiting slaughter. There was no use in delaying the inevitable. That blunt honesty struck a chord within Kratos. With a rare smirk, he recognized something familiar in the boy's bleak clarity and extended an invitation. From that moment, Zephyros became the demon record keeper. That day Kratos made a vow to break the cycle of internal predation that plagued their kind. In the present, Zephyros now witnessed a once revered demon lord, one not defeated by force but by the weight of remorse. Rather than speak, he simply moved. Without a word, he grabbed a hoe and began tilling the earth. This subtle defiance caught Hartox's attention. He understood. Orders rang out. The field transformed into action. No war cries, no blades, just hands and tools. The demons, hardened from countless battles, responded to a different call now, one of soil, sweat, and solidarity. Their chants became rhythmic, echoing their new resolve. They sang of plowing through hardship, of oxen moving slow but steady, and of calloused hands pushing through resistance. Kratos, watching in silence, slowly grasped their intent. They had not been broken, they were ready. His eyes sparked with realization. Assignments were given with purpose. One unit would seek out every viable potato. Others prepared tools, sliced seed potatoes, aligned rows, raised soil beds. Zephyros would ensure the blades remained spotless. Hartox would take command of the front effort. Agerat was sent to gather all equipment. Kratos, filled with renewed conviction, raised a clenched fist. Their unified response echoed, a declaration of purpose, of harvest. Among them, Baal charged like a beast of burden, rope clenched between teeth, dragging a plow with raw, unfiltered strength. The image struck Kratos deeply. In that instant, the act of farming revealed itself not as mere cultivation, but war. Against drought, against blight, against failure. Elsewhere, Flute discovered a tiny sprout. Her expression radiated wonder, as if she had unearthed a priceless gem. Declaring it valuable, she lunged for it. But it wouldn't budge. Still tied to a post like a scarecrow, Raster mumbled suggestions half-heartedly. Just when she nearly gave up, another hand joined hers, Agerat's. Together they heaved. From the stubborn soil emerged an enormous root cluster, a potato so massive it could rival a final boss. In a cruel twist of irony, it landed squarely on Raster's face. Flute beamed with accomplishment, and Kratos turned at the commotion. His expression froze. What lay before him wasn't imagined, it was a real potato. Enormous, healthy, and alive. He was speechless. The soil, once barren, had come alive. The explanation came to him suddenly. After the defeat of Planus, faint sprouts had begun appearing. It all made sense. The walking colossus of a forest had redistributed nutrients into the land through its very collapse. Without hesitation, Kratos ordered a full excavation. The farmland burst into activity. Reports of colossal tubers echoed from all sides. A farmer lifted one that nearly needed transport clearance. It was undeniable. The soil was overflowing with bounty. Cries of discovery rang out. T-Bone, ever relaxed, lounged atop a potato the size of a cart, licking it like a sun-warmed treat. Tough demons, once warriors forged in brutality, now danced in joy, arms full of produce, faces beaming like children in spring. Zephyros, voice shaken with emotion, glanced toward Kratos with a question that needed no answer, asking if this is a bountiful harvest. Kratos held the massive crop in his arms. His gaze softened. The weight was real. His voice, usually stern, carried warmth. Tears welled up, not of sorrow but relief. Around him, laughter broke out, unrestrained and pure. And so it was. Against all odds, with hands once trained for war now sowing hope, they had achieved what once felt impossible. A true, bountiful harvest. A harvest awaited, one where hunger would no longer shadow their lives. Within the newly established demon stronghold, Kratos, bearing the title of Demon King, examined a cluttered assortment of makeshift reports pinned to a worn-out board. His gaze was sharp, expression solemn, as he reviewed the current status of the Forsaken regions. The first territory, labeled with a solitary star, Sartl. Its ruling lord had made the mistake of rebelling, an error swiftly met with destruction. Adding to the fortune, once the heart of Frost ceased to pulse, his followers had disappeared like unpaid apprentices on the eve of a festival. The area now lay deserted, an open canvas for any ambitious settler armed with determination and a shovel. Next came the two-star zone, Planus's former domain. The death of its master left his scattered forces in complete disarray. Unsure of their moral compass, they wandered aimlessly, like forgotten side characters abandoned mid-quest. Then there was the third-star domain, Raster. An individual whose most notable legacy involved acting as a literal lightning rod. Oddly enough, perhaps his most meaningful contribution to date. Kratos considered retribution for past disobedience, but it felt akin to blaming a hamster for steering a sinking galleon. The final and most complex, the four-star territory, was home to a serpentine figure known as Tartu. In the original game framework, Tartu had proven trustworthy, which, within demonic standards, implied he was unlikely to commit betrayal that particular day. Kratos weighed the idea of mobilizing reinforcements from regions 2 and 4. These areas remained relatively stable and responsive. However, expanding forces meant escalating logistical demands, additional supplies, more mouths, and the ever-growing challenge of managing resources, particularly meals. Until the next yield, caution was necessary. Zephyros, known also as Ender Zephyros and now a demon monarch in his own right, provided an update. Mass stew production had commenced under prior instructions. Kratos acknowledged the report with a rare glint of satisfaction and ordered that the food vouchers be organized accordingly. At that moment, a subordinate rushed into the chamber, announcing that standby communications had been dispatched to each territory. This piqued Kratos' attention. Were they complying? A brief hesitation followed. The 4-star district, it appeared, was not responding. Tension flickered in Kratos' expression. Why the disobedience? The messenger, wide-eyed and clearly bewildered, offered no reason. No explanation had been given. With evident restraint unraveling, Kratos leaned forward. The messenger hadn't even asked? And worse, ask whom exactly? The situation frayed further. Kratos, now stretching his wings with irritation like a worn warrior returning reluctantly to the battlefield, struggled to comprehend how basic inquiries had gone unmade. His thoughts spiraled. This was equivalent to dealing with bureaucratic buffoonery, where forms were submitted in crayon and logic abandoned ship. Zephyros, ever the harsh observer and unsparing commentator, noted how Kratos, despite his current air of benevolence, remained wholly and unmistakably a demon king. A visage so hideous that even time itself would struggle to produce anything more grotesque. Kratos, though calm on the surface, recoiled inwardly at the idea that something even worse could one day emerge. Attempting to bring order back into the conversation, Zephyros inquired about the servants. Had they offered any insights? Where was the Fourth Lord? The truth landed like a bolt of divine punishment. The Fourth Lord had crossed into human territory, amassing bodies for agricultural use. Outwardly, Kratos maintained his composure. Internally, however, he was erupting with alarm. That specific scenario, etched into the game's history, was the trigger. A moment not of balance or challenge, but of utter devastation. The ancient paladin, a harbinger of annihilation, would be awakened not by intention, but by invasion. As long as no borders were crossed, the paladin would remain dormant. But with that blunder, the future became a parade of corpses. Fallen generals, himself shattered and impaled, entire regions crumbling beneath divine wrath. His pulse thundered with urgency. Zephyros, noticing his movement, called out. Where was he going? The answer was self-evident. Kratos had already launched forward like an arrow loosed from a desperate bow. Assistance? Unnecessary. Solo was swifter. As he dashed across the lands, his mind raced. The fall of Planus had elevated the mana seed to level 4. Attributes had shifted, agility now at an explosive 160%, while other stats such as stamina, mental resilience, strength, and arcane potency remained at modest 10s. He screamed inwardly, embracing every exploit he knew, shortcut pathways, unintended movement techniques, even bending terrain boundaries if needed. A mental map formed, with precise markers, demon-controlled wastelands bordering the Tower of Life, the sacred grave of the Elder Paladin. His destination clear. His panic justified. His mission urgent. He ran, not to conquer but to prevent annihilation. And further out stood Magrav Fortress, a border stronghold separating demonic realms from human dominion. Perched atop the fortress walls, one sentinel narrowed his eyes and raised a hand to signal. Recognition flickered as a familiar figure approached. Another watchman leaned over the parapet, noting the presence of only a single disheveled attendant and an assortment of odd-looking travelers. Below, the fortified gates creaked open. From within strode Commander Wokos. The report came swiftly. Envoy Azrahan, also known as Javier, returned from the wilds looking worn and hollow-eyed. His explanation was simple. A monstrous horde had begun to stir but hadn't even crossed into demonic territory before retreating. He acknowledged the outcome as yet another failed expedition into enemy lands, just like the rest. The soldiers were permitted to rest. As Javier and his companion Lloyd made their way toward the inner gate, a sudden metallic clash halted their steps. Kimchi stood silent as the mood shifted. Wokos's gaze turned glacial, reminding all present of the rule. Only those who had once left could return. Javier's pulse quickened. He attempted to defend the old man's presence, claiming the aged one had rescued him in the lawless zone and posed no danger. Yet Wokos remained unmoved. Before tensions rose further, Lloyd stepped forward, donning his most charming merchant facade, and pulled a glittering bribe from beneath his coat. The gesture backfired catastrophically. With a punishing blow, Wokos struck Lloyd so violently that his future lineage might have felt it across generations. The commander's fury ignited, and his accusation struck deeper than the slap itself. What followed escalated swiftly. The blade that had stopped them now hovered dangerously close to the old man's throat. A demand was issued, the cloak must come off, and if there were even a hint of treachery, death would follow. Javier inwardly panicked. He knew that whatever lay beneath the fabric would bring disaster. H turned his gaze slowly toward Lloyd. The moment stretched, and then something erupted. A pressure flooded the air. Killing intent, thick enough to cut through steel, surged from the cloaked figure. The world seemed to pause. Even Woko's faltered in that instant. A horn sounded. Sirens wailed from every tower. A sentry screamed from above. The enemy was here. Beyond the gates, a nightmare force advanced. Giants of flesh and scale, row upon row of demons, forming a living wave of horror that darkened the land. Orders barked through the wind. Lines of defense scrambled into motion. Among the chaos, the supposed servant stood unmoving. Within his mind, something stirred, a familiar sensation like a buried prompt from an old game. Detection of hostile units, directive to eliminate. Outside the fortress, chaos reigned. Huge logs slammed into the gate with thunderous impact. Archers fired volley after volley from the walls, arrows slicing through the sky. But the enemy struck back with crude ingenuity, stones tied to ropes, flung like siege hammers, smashing barriers and skulls alike. It was less a battle and more a construction site gone mad. The main gate creaked under relentless pressure, wood splintering with each ram's hit. Inside, civilians cowered in corners, eyes wide, breath shallow. The aged instinct screamed to act, centuries of battle reflexes flaring. Past incarnations, all ending in blood, all forced into violence. His hands twitched, yearning for a weapon. If not for Javier's restraining grip, those hands would already be tearing through the enemy. But this time was different. The old warrior scanned the room, families, the elderly, even children, paralyzed with fear. Perhaps now was not the time to flee but to fight. Then the moment broke. A wooden groan echoed louder than before, and the gate collapsed inward with a final, devastating crash. The flood began. Demons surged through the opening, claws, teeth, war cries. At the head marched a serpentine monstrosity, Tartu, weapon raised, issuing his command to raise the defenders and turn their corpses into fertilizer. Commander Woko's shout split the chaos. He called for the destruction of the rear bridge. A soldier hesitated, stunned. The commander's eyes burned with desperation. Death was inevitable, but the homeland had to be protected. No demon could be allowed to cross. The order flew, and in moments, the rear bridge detonated into a storm of debris and smoke. Any escape was now severed. Javier's complexion turned ashen, lips dry. He could hear the explosion ringing in his skull. The bridge was gone. Lloyd beside him turned a shade paler, nausea clinging to his features like sweat. The grim truth settled, there would be no escape. Among the defenders, one cried out in despair over dreams unfulfilled. Without warning, a cataclysmic blast ruptured the air. A segment of the outer wall shattered next, sending stone and dust cascading into the chaos. Tension turned instantly into bedlam. Shrieks filled the air, bodies scattered in all directions, many stumbling in blind panic. Amid the frenzy, a colossal demon surged from the ranks, its massive hand descending into the sea of people to snatch a young girl. Her shrill cry pierced the air, matched by the agonized scream of her mother. Instinct seized Javier. He sprinted forward, but was immediately halted by a firm grip from Lloyd. Meanwhile, the kimchi remained still, entirely composed. A moment later, the demon's torso simply vanished, erased in an instant as if sliced from existence. The child plummeted from the severed grasp, but Javier broke free, diving through the smoke to catch her midair. He cradled her during the roll, absorbing the impact. Even Lloyd stood stunned, struggling to comprehend what had just unfolded. Above, Kimchi descended, his cloak catching the wind in a silent display. His gaze swept the battlefield until it locked onto Tartu. With no sound but the whisper of fabric, Kimchi landed directly in front of him. There were no theatrics, no glowing runes or swelling music, only a solid thud as his boots met the ground. Tartu's eyes narrowed, puzzled by the Kimchi's attire. The outlandish clothing seemed out of place, almost comical. Kimchi remained unshaken, projecting calm authority as he attempted to de-escalate. Tartu, amused and defiant, dismissed the Kimchi's authority entirely, questioning what he could possibly do in such garb. What followed was silence so tense it pulled the air taut. Kimchi didn't so much as blink before delivering a threat with the cold finality of a closing tomb. The atmosphere shifted like a storm front arriving, weighty, electric. Tartu let out a low snarl, lifted his weapon and lunged. Kimchi didn't budge. His head tilted slightly as though listening to an inner voice. Deep in thought, he questioned whether this confrontation was inevitable. Resolution settled into his bones. There would be no more hesitation. In that instant, his eyes flared with chilling focus. Before Kimchi could react, Kratos delivered a powerful hit, creating a dramatic entry. The decision was made, he would become the blade against his own kind. His foot struck with sudden ferocity, colliding with Tartu's neck. The demon's weapon spiraled away, landing far beyond the skirmish. Kimchi stood impassive, unreadable, as Tartu skidded across the earth like discarded rubble. Not far away, Kratos, the current demon king, watched in mounting panic. Sweat poured down his temples, his thoughts unraveling. This unexpected appearance of his other self had sent his mind into chaos. Breathless and overwhelmed, he felt as though he'd sprinted headlong into a nightmare. His gaze locked onto Kimchi, internal dread rising. Why had this version chosen now, of all times, to appear? Tartu, dazed and battered, turned his gaze toward Kratos. A flicker of recognition passed through his eyes. He attempted to speak. Kratos answered not with words but with a savage stomp to the face. Rage poured from him as he delivered blow after blow, his fury a physical storm. It wasn't just violence, it was punishment, frustration, desperation. Questions spilled out in angry bursts. Why the insubordination? Why wage war against humanity? Tartu weakly attempted to justify himself, claiming rank, but another crushing strike silenced him. Kratos barely paused, turning only briefly to glance at Kimchi before unleashing another round of furious kicks. Each strike carried not just power but disbelief. They had worked for peace. They had built something stable, quiet lives in hidden fields, trying to exist like harmless vermin beneath notice. That was the agreement. No bloodshed. Just survival. And now, because of one reckless act, everything teetered on collapse. Beneath the rage, what truly gripped Kratos was fear. He silently pleaded for leniency. Just this once, just this one mistake, he hoped would not bring ruin. Let the demons live. Then Kimchi finally spoke, breaking the silence with a revelation that froze Kratos in place. Recognition had struck. Kimchi had seen through everything. He knew exactly who stood before him. Kratos's foot halted mid-kick. His entire form stiffened, breath catching in his throat. Knees trembling, sweat running cold, his thoughts spiraled. His identity had been exposed. The worst-case scenario had just arrived. It was at this moment he knew. He fucked up. The reptilian at the front of the warriors stopped, clearly confused, having just heard something far too strange to ignore. He looked back to where aged Kimchi and Kratos were, with the reptilian king lying on the ground. But the distance made it impossible to understand the conversation. Suddenly, Kratos seemed to have made a life-or-death decision. His body leaned forward as if about to attack with full fury. Aged Kimchi kept an impassive expression while Kratos suddenly took a step, then drove his horns into the ground, leaving both reptilians and warriors equally perplexed. Kratos was in a position far from dignified for a demon lord. Upside down, with his claws and horns embedded in the earth and his rear proudly pointed toward the sky. Aged Kimchi watched the scene, unsure whether what made him more uncomfortable was the situation itself or the fact he was staring at Kratos' rear. The reptilians tried to process what they were seeing. One noticed the enemy didn't know how to react, while another wondered if this was the demon lord's newest and most intimidating threat pose. Aged Kimchi looked at Kratos and asked what he was doing. Kratos remained in that position, explaining that he was performing a bow, a gesture expressing extreme gratitude or an apology. He stated that, as demon lord, he had no intention of invading the human world, and that his subordinate had acted on his own, which was why he came quickly to contain the situation. The hero doubted Kratos, questioning if he really thought anyone would believe the words of a demon. Kratos began driving his horns into the ground repeatedly, asking to be believed and promising to apologize dozens, even hundreds of times, until his horns were completely worn down. A little farther away, one reptilian thought that act of tearing the ground with his horns was a threatening stance, like that of a bull. Another thought it was exactly what was to be expected from a demon lord. Kratos thought about how pathetic and shameful he must look, but knew that if he didn't do it, all demons would die. Sweat ran down his face as he clenched his teeth, determined to act as a responsible leader. He remembered that when he was a child, he once saw a worker kneeling before his superior, with his forehead almost to the ground, begging for forgiveness. The superior, with a cruel smile, mocked him and made it clear it would not end anytime soon, even threatening his reputation. Kratos had decided he would endure any humiliation if it meant protecting his people. Back in the present, he kept striking his horns against the ground countless times without stopping, opening holes in the dry earth with each blow. Aged Kimchi watched the scene with a steady gaze, stating that all of it was useless and that he existed to kill him. With a grim expression, Aged Kimchi raised his heart-shaped wand, determined to end Kratos right there and then wipe out the remaining demons. However, Kratos made no attempt to defend himself. He simply continued slamming his head against the ground with force. That echoed in the hero's mind, that he should kill them all. Until Aged Kimchi stopped, noticing a strange pattern in the demon lord. The hero realized that Kratos had been hitting his head on the ground exactly 10 times, then making a brief pause and then another 10 strikes. It felt oddly familiar. Then he had a revelation. The Call of Duty bore a resemblance to Kratos. While scouring the demon's land, he always did everything in sets of 10. Before stepping into a trap, he would count 10 times. Even when doing some odd, meaningless act, it was always intense, repeating the pattern as if following an invisible command. Back to Kratos. He looked regretful, pleading for mercy with such emphasis that it completely contrasted with the usual demeanor of a demon lord. Aged Kimchi stood there, surprised, keeping still while Kratos remained kneeling, head bowed before him. In his thoughts, he questioned why the Call of Duty had presented itself in the form of the demon lord. Feeling lost, he told Kratos to stop it. Kratos lifted his sweaty face toward him, and Aged Kimchi merely muttered for the demon to disappear, warning that he was one step away from losing his patience and killing him right there. To Kratos, that threat sounded like a relief, making him smile. Quickly, he picked up the reptilian king of the 4th region and placed him over his shoulder, thanking him in an emotional tone and promising never to forget that gesture for the rest of his life. Then he ordered the other reptilian demons of the 4th army to retreat immediately, shouting for everyone to withdraw quickly. The reptilians were confused by the sudden turn of events, not fully understanding what had just happened, but they followed the demon lord's order without question. Kratos led the way, carrying the reptilian king on his shoulder, followed by the other reptilians advancing with swords in hand. Meanwhile, Aged Kimchi remained still amid the cloud of dust raised by their rush. The reptilian king lifted his head, beginning to regain consciousness, and saw Aged Kimchi's back as he stood apart from the group. In a burst of fury, he broke free from Kratos and charged with determination toward his target, claws aimed at an enemy who seemed unaware of his presence. Kratos tried to stop the attack but failed. Aged Kimchi, with minimal effort, extended his arm to push the opponent, and thanks to his overwhelming strength, that simple gesture was enough to shatter and sever the reptilian king's arms, hurling him violently toward the Rocky Mountains. Kratos, standing behind the other reptilians, watched the scene in disbelief, his hand still raised in a motion of attempted intervention. Soon, the heavy, dull sound of the reptilian king's body smashing against the rocky wall echoed, followed by the impact of his arms falling separately to the ground. The king's blood slowly trickled down the mountain as Kratos watched, body trembling and sweat dripping down his face. Aged Kimchi's bright blue eyes were fixed intensely on him. Horrified, Kratos felt a whirlwind of negative thoughts flood his mind. Aged Kimchi acknowledged that this decision had not come from Kratos, but from someone else. Without another word, he tossed his cape back and began to walk away, leaving a clear warning that if Kratos so much as showed his horn in the human world again, he was certain he would kill him. Kratos grew tense at those final words and remained still, staring at the hero's silhouette as it grew more distant. The scene shifts back to the wall that separates the village from the surrounding Rocky Mountains. Ryjav, surprised to see Aged Kimchi, asks what happened to him. At his side, Diol expresses concern over the hero's sudden disappearance. Aged Kimchi, wearing a serious and downcast expression, replies that there was a battle. Ryjav, incredulous, asks if he really faced those fearsome demons. Wokos appears from behind and, placing a hand on his chest, acknowledges Aged Kimchi's courage, apologizing for any previous disrespect. He mentions how everyone saw the hero defeat the demons with a single blow and make the rest kneel. Aged Kimchi remains silent, unsure what to say, while Ryjav, surprised, confirms the hero's strength but leaves the sentence unfinished. Suddenly, Wokos raises his voice and calls on everyone to cheer for Aged Kimchi, the one who protects the fortress. The warriors raise their weapons in celebration, shouting in unison. Despite the acclaim, Aged Kimchi keeps a blank expression. At that moment, a message appears stating that this is his life in Zoth, and that he has finally escaped the cycle of repeated massacres. Aged Kimchi tilts his head and eventually reveals that he chose the path of sparing others, even though he killed 2 of them, leaving the warriors wide-eyed in surprise. The The scene changes to the abandoned region known as the Fourth Star, a land of storms and desolation. Kratos was running across the dry, cracked ground, with an army of reptilians following at a distance. Already impatient, he thought they had finally arrived, mentally complaining about how slow it was to drag such a large group along. Stopping, he turned, clenched his fists, and ordered the reptilians to return to their castles or homes, warning them that if they invaded the human realm again, he would kill them himself. One of the reptilians stammered, explaining that they only acted that way because they had received orders from Lord Tarthu. Kratos, with no patience for excuses, replied that he didn't want to hear justifications and ordered them to go home immediately. He continued walking, his footsteps echoing over the hardened earth. In his thoughts, Kratos reflected that he was following the path set by the game, where there was no room for mistakes or shortcuts, which made everything take even longer. He knew he needed to hurry to tend to the great potato harvest. Kratos then came across a well in the middle of that abandoned place and thought that, if it still worked, traveling wouldn't be such a big problem anymore. He approached the well, looked inside, and recognized that it contained the system that controlled power-ups and teleportation. He had already tested several of them before, but none had worked. Kneeling down, he placed his arms inside the well and wished to teleport, but believed it wouldn't happen because he wasn't a paladin. Suddenly, a blue light began to illuminate the well, surprising Kratos. A blue screen appeared, informing him that because of his encounter with a paladin, a new game system had been unlocked. The teleportation function through abandoned wells was now available. Kratos' body was sucked into the well, initiating teleportation. Then, another blue screen appeared, stating that all the wells he had visited since arriving in this world had been activated, and asking where he would like to go. During the journey, he thought about going to the Demon Lord's castle underground, but wondered if the location was still intact. The screen confirmed that the well remained intact. Kratos confirmed his choice, and the screen indicated that he was being transported to the underground of the Demon Lord's castle. His body continued to be propelled by the intense teleportation energy, wrapped in a blue blur that dragged him at high speed through the unknown space. Azurat and Flute were in the underground of the Demon Lord's castle. Azurat was holding a broken piece of wood in his hand, frustrated over yet another useless tool. Flute, kneeling beside a pile of small stones, was carefully removing the debris, hoping to find at least one farming tool that still worked. In the middle of the hole Flute was digging, a sudden intense blue glow appeared, leaving her confused. Suddenly, the face of the Demon Lord emerged in the middle of that blue light, wearing an expression of pure dread. Kratos' body burst out of the hole with a thunderous roar, sending rocks and dust flying in all directions. Flute's eyes went so wide in shock it seemed they might pop right out of her head. The scare was so great that she simply collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Azurat turned toward the noise, desperation on his face as he tried to understand what had just happened. Flute lay sprawled on the floor, fainted, right in front of Kratos. He, in turn, tilted his head back, fighting against an intense wave of nausea, his hands pressed firmly over his mouth, trying to hold back what seemed on the verge of escaping. Kratos couldn't contain it. Suddenly, a powerful stream erupted from his mouth, forming a vibrant rainbow. Realizing what was about to happen, Azurat rushed toward Flute. In a desperate move, he threw himself in front of her just in time. Kratos' rainbow-shaped vomit sprayed forcefully, landing squarely on Azurat's back. Flute, who had been unconscious on the ground, woke up in shock. Kratos sat at the edge of the well, wiping his mouth with a tired motion, his stomach churning, mentally grumbling about the lack of delicacy in the teleportation. He wondered if they couldn't just transport him more smoothly the way it would happen in a game. In front of him, Azurat lay sprawled on the floor, covered in that colorful vomit, while Flute scrambled frantically to help her friend. Flute tried to hold back the tears welling in her eyes as she looked at Azurat lying there. Ignoring the entire scene before him, a smile spread across Kratos' face. He reflected that, considering he'd managed to get here with only one bout of vomiting, it was actually a good cost-benefit ratio. Without wasting time, he was already preparing to get started on whatever came next. Kratos rose gloriously, fists clenched, an eager smile on his face, already full of determination to begin mass production of giant potatoes. Meanwhile, Flute wailed in despair, crying over Azurat, who still lay unconscious on the floor. In the storage area, Kratos stood beside Zephyros, admiring the massive pile of giant potatoes, thinking that no matter how many times he saw it, he was always impressed. Zephyros reported that the mist created by Hartok had already been completed. Kratos remained silent for a moment, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the potato pile. Then he leaned down, picked one up, and immediately felt that something seemed off, an inexplicable discomfort at the touch of the potato. He froze for a moment, gripping it tightly, his gaze locked on it with intensity. Frustration spread across his face as though something was terribly wrong. Kratos climbed onto the pile, picking up each potato to examine before tossing it aside. His sharp gaze searched for something amiss, any detail out of place that could justify his frustration. Zephyros watched with curiosity and asked if there was a problem with the potatoes. Among the pile, Kratos clenched his teeth, glared at one in his hands, and declared that the giant potatoes had no sprouts. Zephyros asked if the absence of sprouts meant the potatoes wouldn't grow. Kratos, teeth clenched and eyes shut in disbelief, confirmed that these potatoes were sterile. In the Demon Lord's temporary castle, Kratos sat in a makeshift wooden chair serving as a throne. Beside him, Zephyros stood, while the 4 demon generals waited before him. Resting his head on his fist, frustrated, Kratos explained that even if they planted those giant potatoes, not a single one would sprout. Hartok explained that the potatoes had been unnaturally genetically altered and, as a result, had lost their ability to reproduce, becoming mutants. Baal lamented, asking if that meant they couldn't eat them. Beside him, Sergei turned and replied impatiently that eating them wasn't the problem. The real issue was that they couldn't be planted. Once they ate everything they had now, that would be the end. Still disheartened, Kratos remarked that he had never planned to rely on potatoes forever. They were vulnerable to disease and once infected, the entire crop would be lost. Azurat observed that sooner or later they would have to plant something else. Then, with irony, he questioned what else could possibly exist in that land besides potatoes. Kratos answered bluntly that there was simply nothing else. The Demon Lord went on, revealing, however, that he knew of a place full of seeds for planting. Zephyros, upon hearing this, grew thoughtful, wondering if Kratos was referring to what he suspected. A land full of crops. Kratos finally revealed that it was the land of humans, and the general stood still, staring at him intently. Baal burst out in excitement, imagining invasion, plunder, and another full-scale war, while Sergei, irritated, shouted back at him, trying to get him to calm down and contain his enthusiasm. Then, more serious, Sergei turned to Kratos and noted his dejection, recognizing that no one hated war more than the Demon Lord himself. Kratos began giving orders to each of them. He instructed Zephyros to immediately begin construction of the giant Chuno and ordered him to remain there to assist Hartok's team of farmers, helping to manage them. Then, turning to Sergei, Baal, and Azurat, his expression shifted completely, now terrifyingly eager, as he announced that they would go to the human lands, sell the Chuno, and use the money to buy seeds. He remembered the problem that was aged kimchi and thought that as long as they didn't run into him, everything would be fine, and even if they did, he already had a plan ready. Kratos already had a contingency prepared should his plan fail. His commanders stood frozen, unable to process the sheer boldness of what he proposed. Zephyros, in particular, believed that Kratos had completely lost his sanity and questioned why such absurdity was even being considered. Pointing toward the 3 generals selected for the mission, he highlighted the glaring weakness in the strategy. He remarked on Bahal, emphasizing how monstrous his appearance would seem from the perspective of any human. His assessment continued with the hooded Azurat, whom he described as a walking omen of disaster, resembling a serial killer with unnatural skin. Finally, his scrutiny landed on Sergei, whose armored frame and pallid complexion gave him the appearance of a frostbitten human-octopus hybrid plagued by illness. In Zephyros's view, no human would hesitate to brand them as demons and attack without warning. The blunt words sparked outrage. Azurat and Sergei seized the advisor with fury, though he defended himself by claiming he had spoken only the truth. Azurat's temper flared, making it clear that silencing him permanently would be an entirely reasonable course of action. Bahal interjected, insisting that Zephyros's assessment was accurate, claiming he alone looked normal among them. Azurat, however, was quick to counter, declaring that his fiery hair made him resemble a demon more than any of them. The hooded figure scoffed at Hartok's lack of self-awareness, labeling him as nothing more than a corpse-like husk compared to his own supposed elegance. Sergei, amused by the chaos, remarked that they all resembled boiled fish. This sparked an eruption of insults, with the others turning on him, mockingly reminding him that he was the one likened to a sickly octopus. The quarrel escalated rapidly, devolving into an undignified brawl across the floor. Kratos observed the disorder with his chin resting on his hand, silently reflecting on their fragile egos and how pitiful their squabbling truly seemed. A simple gesture from his raised hand was enough to bring the chaos to a halt. Attempting to ease the tension, Credos offered a mocking remark about their lack of attractiveness, implying none of them were worth showing off in the first place. The room fell into dead silence at the jab, but Credos considered the awkward stillness a victory, since it restored order. Turning his attention back to the matter at hand, he asked Zephyros about the supplies taken from the hidden passage in Saruthal's castle. The advisor confirmed, producing a red cloth that concealed a cluster of small writhing blue creatures. The beings, known as Kekyu, wiggled and squeaked with an odd, almost endearing charm. When one of the blobs leapt forward with a squeal, Sergei stared in bewilderment, unsure of what he was looking at. Credos revealed the truth with a wide grin. They were living elixirs of metamorphosis, meant to be consumed in order to transform into non-demonic forms. The commanders stared at the slimy creatures in shock as Credos declared that this would be their method of infiltration into human lands. Disgust rippled through the group, some horrified at the suggestion of consuming them. Credos, dripping with sarcasm, retorted that they surely had not expected the blobs to be applied like ointment. Bahal, far less concerned, bellowed that he had no issue with strange food. Without hesitation, he seized one of the squirming elixirs and shoved it into his mouth. A loud crunch echoed as he chewed, while the others watched in disbelief. He roared in outrage at the foul taste, leaving another to wonder aloud if he had truly expected something so grotesque to be palatable. The sight left the room in stunned silence, the tension now mixed with sheer disbelief. Without warning, Bahal began to radiate a dazzling golden light, while the others observed in astonishment. Credos noted that the outcome of the metamorphosis depended entirely on the user's personality, silently hoping that none of them would emerge too feral. From his vantage point behind a stone pillar, Credos watched as the glow intensified, flooding the area with blinding brilliance. When the light finally weakened, a new outline appeared within the dispersing smoke, accompanied by a hesitant voice announcing the change. In a sudden burst, Bahal's body reshaped into that of a striking, well-built man with flowing crimson hair, adopting a shy, almost awkward pose. Credos understood then that the elixir of metamorphosis drew upon one's innermost wishes, realizing that this refined form represented Baal's true self. Obeying the decree of their demon lord, Sergei struck at one of the blue elixirs, giving rise to speculation that her hidden desire might have been beauty itself. Kephiros produced a mirror to reflect the result, revealing Sergei transformed into a fluffy azure alpaca with long eyelashes. The transformed creature shrieked its new identity while a caption revealed the truth. Sergei, the cold sovereign, had secretly yearned to embody the warmth of a gentle spirit. Impatience surged through Azurat, who seized the hooded demon's face and forced the elixir down. Moments later, a massive, gray pelican-shaped beast with crimson eyes emerged from swirling clouds, its screech echoing across the skies. The caption revealed this form as Azurat, the blood-drinking prince, whose deepest desire was the freedom of endless years. Credos then declared himself next, biting down on a blue elixir. Within the veil of transformation smoke, a shadowy figure took shape before finally clearing, unveiling a pale man with long hair, carrying the air of a bitter graduate student. The transformation was underwhelming, and Credos worried inwardly that it lacked impact. In the mirror's reflection, the change seemed almost trivial, drawing uncertain stares from the alpaca Sergei and pelican Azurat. He remarked mockingly to himself that he appeared no more than someone with failing health, then issued the order for the expedition team to depart. Thus began their strange march across the desert. Credos, Baal in his new form, an alpaca and a pelican. A sudden chime resounded as a glowing system window materialized before Credos, startling him. The notification warned that receiving damage or activating abilities would revert them to their original demon bodies, forcing the party to proceed with caution. Their plan required using an abandoned well as a teleportation anchor. By joining hands they activated the warp and were pulled through together. Upon arrival, Credos clutched his stomach uneasily, while the others struggled with the disorienting side effects, rainbow-colored vomit marking their discomfort. Raising his gaze to a distant fortress, Credos pondered how they might gain entry past its fortified gates. His thoughts turned to the hero-aged Kimchi, suspecting that the man had likely already advanced deeper into human territory. Enough time had passed, he reasoned, for the hero to have moved on, and the disguise from the elixir should be enough to prevent recognition regardless. Even so, sweat beaded on his brow as his hand gripped at his throat in nervous anticipation. Meanwhile, from the fortress walls, a scroll was unfurled as a lookout cried out about the approach of a suspicious group. Guards speculated whether demons were near, though one dismissed the idea, claiming the newcomers did not resemble such beings. Another muttered that the strangers merely appeared sickly. From the gate stepped a man clad in blue armor, his short white hair and pointed goatee giving him a severe presence. He planted himself firmly before the travelers, barring their path. Identifying them as exiles, he ordered their immediate retreat, denying them passage. Within the mind of the alpaca, the thought arose that this obstacle had been inevitable, for the mission was never destined to be simple. Kratos internally confirmed this expectation, attributing the blockade to heightened vigilance following recent demonic incursions. Yet a sly smirk crossed Kratos' face, for as a seasoned player who knew the entirety of the game's narrative, he already possessed a strategy. His eyes burned red with calculating intent. Kratos, consumed by greed, let out a chilling laugh as he proclaimed that even as an exile, he had brought genuine treasures from demon territory. The guard's stern demeanor faltered, his brow arching in surprise at the mention of such a claim. Kratos reveled inwardly, certain that the human king's hunger for intelligence about the demon lands would compel the guards to allow passage. The guard's attention shifted toward what trailed behind, questioning if the so-called treasure lay there. Kratos, grinning broadly, confirmed with enthusiasm. He presented the alpaca and the pelican, proudly declaring them exotic beasts brought from the heart of demon territory, even boasting of their supposedly delicious meat. With grand gestures, he indicated his disguised commanders, who strained to pull a small cart. The guard examined them with suspicion, muttering about the absurdity of claiming such creatures were captured alive from demon lands. With a dismissive glance, the guard identified them plainly as nothing more than an ordinary pelican and alpaca, questioning the sense in offering such things to a king. Kratos was left dumbfounded, internally railing against the flawed logic of a medieval setting where pelicans and alpacas apparently roamed in abundance. The guard, unimpressed, declared them foul-smelling and worthless, demanding their immediate departure. Rage boiled within the alpaca, her pride deeply scarred by the insult. She erupted in fury, her voice directed squarely at Kratos, before storming toward the guard in wrath. The guard froze, astonished by the creature's articulate speech, realizing instantly that it was no mere animal. Kratos recognized the opening and seized upon it. Bursting into manic laughter, he seized the furious alpaca and proclaimed that beings from the demon land spoke with clarity. To enhance the illusion, he grasped the pelican and prodded it to mimic animal-like sounds. A sharp blow struck the bird, and with a resounding cry it shrieked its strange call. Convinced at last, the guard raised his voice and granted them passage through the gates. As the mismatched band stepped forward, one among them declared the ruse a success. Yet the guard halted them once more, cautioning that although they carried rare beasts, they remained exiles and could not wander the royal domain freely. A compromise was offered. They could join the company of a royal envoy encamped nearby. Kratos inwardly seethed at the inconvenience but forced himself to adapt. Feigning humility, he assumed the role of a lowly traveler, claiming embarrassment at having brought no true treasures from the demon's realm. He introduced himself under the name Kim Jang-chil, presenting Baal under the alias Bob Badstench, before the envoy Javier Azrahan and his attendant, Diol Frontera. Both Javier and his servant regarded the pair with suspicion, remarking that such names were strange for supposed exiles. A soldier in the envoy's retinue stepped forward, exposing the lie by insisting he had never seen them in the village. Panic struck Kratos as the envoy's guards unsheathed their weapons, demanding the truth while he realized they had been exposed. Meanwhile, Diol whispered under his breath about his young master's chronic face blindness, recognizing it as the cause of the confusion. Attempting to redirect, he discreetly pointed toward Kratos, but Javier only grew more puzzled. Desperate, Diol urged his master not to accept the strangers, warning they might indeed be demons. Javier, however, dismissed the concern with firm denial. Clasping his hands nervously, the envoy covered the situation by claiming he had no memory of them simply because no conversation had occurred before. Kratos, smirking slyly, perceived at once how easily the potato-faced envoy could be bent and exploited. Diol plotted quietly, considering the sickly Kratos frail and imagining he could discard them once their usefulness ended. Javier then cheerfully announced their departure, mentioning that the remainder of their escort awaited outside. Among them stood a blonde-haired warrior introduced as aged Kimchi, tasked with accompanying the group. At that moment, Kratos felt icy sweat bead along his skin, his expression collapsing into sheer horror at the disastrous revelation. The hero aged Kimchi regarded them sharply, his calculating eyes cutting through the air. Kratos faltered, forcing a trembling greeting while convinced inwardly that death was imminent. To his astonishment, Aged merely remarked on his ill appearance and advised him to look after his health. Stunned into silence by such unexpected courtesy, Kratos could only gape in utter bewilderment. As Javier proclaimed the beginning of their journey toward the capital, the newly assembled company set out together. He silently marveled at the fact that Aged Kimchi had failed to recognize him, proof that the elixir of metamorphosis had fulfilled its purpose. Yet the hero's sharp eyes still lingered on them, carrying the weight of suspicion. That evening the combined parties, the demons in disguise and the envoy's retinue, gathered around a crackling fire. Kratos inwardly trembled, realizing the peril surrounding them. A single strike would shatter their altered forms, leaving them doomed before the hero's strength. His mind raced, deciding he had no need to continue all the way to the capital. Simply selling the Chuno and abandoning these humans would suffice. Aged Kimchi's gaze flickered with unease, as if he sensed something unnatural. Kratos felt dread tighten his chest, cold sweat beating across his skin. Forcing a strained grin, he attempted to appear harmless, though the crushing weight of the hero's stare drained his body of strength. Making his decision, Kratos resolved to flee into the night with his subordinates. Beyond the tents, Sergi in her alpaca form and Azurat in the shape of a pelican slept soundly. Kratos shook Baal awake, who muttered complaints about losing precious beauty rest, which only earned the demon lord's scorn. Together with their companions, they quietly prepared to vanish into the darkness. Moving cautiously through the encampment, Kratos concentrated on their escape. Suddenly, Sergi broke the silence, speaking clearly and startling him, admitting it had taken effort to master speech in her new body. Grimly, Kratos dismissed the humans as irrelevant now that the fortress lay behind them, though unease gnawed at him, knowing their mission must be completed before exposure doomed them all. Their stealth was cut short when Aged Kimchi appeared suddenly, outlined against the silver glow of the full moon. An eye patch now concealed one eye, his expression unreadable as he stood barring their path. Kratos let out a horrified cry, realizing the entire plan had collapsed.